I took the job because no one else would. That's what the man at the office told me. He didn't smile when he said it. He just slid the paper across the desk and tapped it once, like he wanted the decision to be quick. Like the longer I sat there, the more likely I was to walk away. Night shift only, he said. 6 hours. Midnight to 6. Easy work. I remember asking him why the last caretaker left. He didn't answer right away. He just leaned back in his chair and looked past me like he was thinking about something far away. Then he said, "They all leave?" That should have been enough for me. It should have made me stand up, thank him, and go find something else. But I needed the money. Rent was already late. My phone had been cut off the week before. And something about the job, it sounded quiet. I thought quiet was what I needed. So I signed the paper. That's how I ended up standing in front of Black Hollow Asylum on a cold night, just a little before midnight, holding a ring of keys that felt heavier than they should. The building was bigger than I expected. Not tall, but wide. Long wings stretched out on both sides like arms that had been left there too long. The windows were dark. Most of them were broken. The rest were covered from the inside, like someone had tried to keep the world out or keep something in. The wind moved through the empty grounds, brushing over the dry grass. It made a soft sound, like whispering. I told myself it was just the wind. I walked up to the front door. The keys clinked together as I searched for the right one. My hands felt stiff, colder than they should have been. When I finally found it and pushed it into the lock, it didn't go in smoothly. I had to force it a little. The door opened with a long, slow creak. Inside, the air felt different. Still, thick, like it hadn't moved in years. I stepped in and closed the door behind me. The sound echoed farther than I expected. For a moment, I just stood there. The main hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by a few working bulbs spaced far apart. The light was yellow and weak. It didn't reach the corners. It didn't reach the ends of the hall. I could smell something old, dust mostly, but there was something else underneath it. Something faint and sour, like damp fabric that had never fully dried. I told myself I'd get used to it. There was a small desk near the entrance. That was mine, according to the man at the office. A chair sat behind it, slightly tilted, like someone had stood up in a hurry and never came back. I set my bag down and sat. The chair made a soft creaking sound under my weight. It didn't feel stable, but it held. There was a logbook on the desk. Old. The cover was worn, the edges curled. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting. Dates times simple notes. Patrol completed. Nothing unusual. Lights checked. All stable. But as I turned the pages, the writing started to change. It got messier, faster. Like whoever wrote, it didn't want to spend too much time sitting still. One entry caught my eye. Third night. Heard movement in East Wing. Probably animals. The next one, just a day later, said, "Not animals." I paused there, my finger resting on the page. I don't know why that line stayed with me. It was so simple. No explanation. Just those two words. Not animals. I flipped ahead a few more pages. The entries stopped after that. No final note. No goodbye. Just blank pages. I closed the book. The silence around me felt heavier now, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I checked the time. 12:17 a.m. Still early. I remembered what the man had told me. Just do a walkthrough every hour. Make sure the doors stay locked. That's it. Easy work. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the dimness, moving slowly over peeling paint and cracked walls. Old signs hung crookedly, some barely readable. Words like ward and observation faded into the background. My footsteps echoed as I walked. Too loud. I tried to step softer, but it didn't help much. The building seemed to hold on to every sound and stretch it out. I reached the first intersection and turned left toward the east wing. I'm not sure why I chose that direction first. Maybe it was because of the logbook. The air felt colder as I moved farther in. Not freezing, just thinner, like the warmth from the outside never made it this far. Doors lined both sides of the hall. Most of them were open. Inside, I could see empty rooms. rusted bed frames, thin mattresses covered in stains I didn't want to think about. I stopped at one doorway and shined my light inside. The room was small, bare, but there were marks on the wall. Long, thin scratches clustered together in one spot. They were too high to be accidental. I felt a slow, quiet unease settle in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just old damage. The building had probably been abandoned for years. Still, I stepped back into the hallway a little quicker than I meant to. As I kept walking, I started to notice something else. The doors. Some of them were closed. That didn't match what I remembered. I was sure most of them had been open when I first looked down the hall. I stopped and looked behind me. The hallway stretched back the way I came. The doors I had passed were still there, still quiet. I walked back a few steps and tried one of the closed doors. It didn't open. Locked. I checked another. Also locked. I stood there for a moment, trying to remember if I had seen them closed before. Maybe I just hadn't paid attention. That was possible. The place was big, easy to miss things. I let out a slow breath. Just the first night, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded strange in the hallway, too soft, like it didn't belong. I turned and continued forward. At the end of the east wing, there was a large set of double doors. One of them hung slightly open. A darker space waited beyond. I stepped closer, raising my flashlight. The beam flickered once, just once, then it steadied again. I pushed the door open a little more. The room beyond looked like a common area. Chairs overturned, tables pushed against the walls. A wide, empty space in the center. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something move. Not a shape, not a person, just movement, like the air itself had shifted. I froze, the silence pressing around me. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No sound at all. After a while, I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks. The light, the shadows, it happens. I didn't go into the room. I stepped back instead. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not exactly. Just wrong. I made my way back down the hallway, slower this time. When I returned to the main desk, I felt a small sense of relief, like I had come back from somewhere farther away than I realized. I sat down and checked the time again. 1:02 a.m. Only 1 hour had passed. It felt longer. I opened the logbook again, staring at that last line. Not animals. My eyes drifted to the blank pages after it. For a moment, I thought about writing something. Just a simple note. First night, all quiet, but my hand didn't move. I wasn't sure it was true. Somewhere deep in the building, I thought I heard something. A faint sound. Soft, like a distant shuffle or a slow step across the floor. I held my breath and listened. It came again. So quiet I almost missed it. And then it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I sat there, staring into the dim hallway, and realized something I hadn't wanted to admit when I took the job. This place wasn't empty. Not really. And I still had 5 hours left before morning. I didn't sleep the next day. I told myself I would. I lay down, closed my eyes, pulled the blanket up, and waited for rest to come. But every time I drifted close to it, I heard something. Not real sounds. Not exactly. Just echoes of the night before. That soft shuffle. The feeling of something being just out of sight. The way the air inside the asylum had felt like it was holding its breath. So I stayed awake. By the time evening came, my body felt heavy, like I was moving through water. But I still got up. I still put my shoes on. I still picked up the keys. Because I needed the job. That was the only reason. When I got back to Black Hollow Asylum, the sky was already dark. The building looked the same as before. Quiet, empty, waiting. I stood outside for a moment longer than I had the first night. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a light in one of the windows. Maybe someone walking inside. Something to make it feel less still. But there was nothing. So I unlocked the door and went in. The same smell greeted me. Dust and something damp underneath. The same weak lights flickered above. The same long hallway stretched ahead. But it didn't feel the same. It felt aware. I know that doesn't make sense. Buildings aren't aware. They don't notice you. They don't care if you're there or not. But as I stepped inside, I had the strong feeling that something had been waiting for me to come back. I locked the door behind me and walked to the desk. The chair was no longer tilted. It sat straight now, tucked in neatly under the desk. I stopped. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I stood there for a while, staring at it, trying to remember. Maybe I had pushed it in without thinking. Maybe I just didn't notice. That had to be it. I set my bag down slowly and pulled the chair out again. The legs scraped softly against the floor. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. I sat and reached for the logbook. For a second, I hesitated. Then I opened it. The pages looked the same at first. The same neat entries. The same messy ones later on. But when I flipped to the last written page, my stomach tightened. There was a new line. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. The handwriting didn't match the earlier entries. It was smaller, thinner, almost careful. Second night, he came back. I stared at the words, reading them again and again. He came back. A cold feeling moved slowly through my chest. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, watching me. But the hallway was empty. The lights hummed softly above. Nothing moved. I touched the page lightly, as if that would tell me something. The ink was dry. I flipped back a few pages, checking the older entries. Same as before. Then I looked forward again. Blank pages. No other new writing. I closed the book. My hands felt colder now. Someone's messing with me. I whispered. That made more sense. It had to be that. Maybe the man at the office. Maybe someone else with a key. A joke or some kind of test. It didn't feel like a joke. Still, it was better than the other possibility. I checked the time. 12:11 a.m. I decided to start my patrol early. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up. This time, I didn't go to the east wing first. I turned right instead. The west wing felt different almost immediately. The air was warmer here, but not in a comforting way. It felt close, like the walls were a little tighter. The doors along this hallway were mostly closed. I moved slowly, shining my light into each small window. Empty rooms, beds, chairs, nothing unusual. But as I walked, I started to hear something. At first, I thought it was just a building settling. Old pipes, loose panels, normal sounds. Then I realized it wasn't random. It had a pattern. Soft, uneven, like breathing. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I waited. Nothing. I started again, slower this time. And then I heard it again. Not loud, just a faint, soft sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead. I followed it. Each step felt heavier than the last. My flashlight beam moved over the walls, catching small details I hadn't noticed before. Faded numbers above the doors, scratches near the handles, thin lines carved into paint. The sound led me to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open. I didn't remember seeing it that way before. I stood in front of it, listening. The sound was clearer now, not breathing, whispering, so soft I couldn't make out any words, just the shape of speech, the rise and fall of something being said. My hand moved slowly to the door. I pushed it open. The room was empty. A single bed, a chair in the corner, a small desk against the wall. No one inside. The whispering stopped the moment the door moved. I stepped in, my heart beating a little faster now. "Hello," I said quietly. My voice felt wrong in the room. Too loud, too solid. No answer. I walked to the desk. There were papers on it that hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I picked one up. It was a patient record. Old, yellowed at the edges. The name at the top was hard to read, but the rest was clearer. Notes, observations, dates. I flipped through the pages. There were more records underneath. A stack of them, all different names, all filled out. I felt a slow unease settle deeper inside me. Why were these here? Why now? I looked back at the door. Still open, still empty beyond it. I gathered a few of the papers and carried them back with me. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wanted proof. Something real I could look at later in the daylight and make sense of. When I reached the main desk again, I spread the papers out. Each one described a different patient, different symptoms, different notes. But there was something strange about them. The dates. They didn't stop. Most of the building had been abandoned for years. That's what I had been told. But these records, some of them were recent, only a few months old. One of them had a date from last year. I read one more carefully. Patient reports hearing voices at night. Claims the voices know his name. Says they speak even when no one is present. I swallowed slowly. Another one. Patient insists the other rooms are occupied. Staff unable to confirm. My eyes moved across the page. Patient believes the building is full. I leaned back in the chair. The silence around me felt different now. Not empty. Full. The thought slipped into my mind without asking. I looked down at the papers again. There were dozens of names, dozens of records, all describing things that sounded familiar. Whispers, movement, the feeling of being watched. I reached for the logbook again. My hand shook slightly as I opened it. The last page had changed. There was another line now, written beneath the first. Second night. He hears us. I froze. The room felt colder suddenly. I turned my head slowly toward the hallway. For a moment, everything was still. Then, very softly, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard it again, whispering. This time, it didn't stop. It moved, like it was drifting through the halls, getting closer. I held my breath, listening. The sound grew just a little clearer. Not loud, never loud, but enough to almost understand. I couldn't make out full words, just pieces, broken sounds. But one thing stood out. A single word, repeated again and again in a soft, patient tone. Stay. The air felt heavier with each second. The whispers layered over each other, filling the silence. Not one voice. Many. All low, all calm, all close. I sat there, unable to move, as the sound slowly wrapped around me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought began to form. Quiet, slow, unwelcome. Maybe the records weren't old. Maybe they were still being written. And maybe the patients never left. I didn't leave after that. I thought about it. I really did. There was a moment, maybe around 2 in the morning, when the whispering had faded just enough for me to think clearly again. I sat there at the desk, staring at the door, holding the keys in my hand. I could have walked out. No one would have stopped me. But something kept me in that chair. It wasn't courage. It wasn't curiosity either. It felt more like pressure, like the building itself was leaning in, waiting to see what I would do next. And I had this quiet, sinking feeling that if I left without understanding what was happening, it wouldn't let me go easily. So I stayed. The whispers didn't stop completely, but they moved farther away again, drifting through the halls like they had somewhere else to be. That gave me just enough space to think. I looked down at the patient records spread across the desk. Dozens of names, dozens of stories, all of them ending the same way. No discharge dates, no notes about recovery, just silence. I started flipping through them again, slower this time. That's when I noticed the numbers. Each record had a room number written near the top. Most of them were low numbers. 101, 204, 118. But a few stood out. Higher numbers. 300s. I picked up one of those. Room 317. The handwriting on this one was harder to read. Messier, like it had been written in a hurry. Patient reports persistent presence in room. Claims others are still here. Shows signs of severe distress when removed from assigned space. I felt a small, cold knot form in my chest. I flipped to the next page. More notes. Short, uneven. Patient refuses to leave room 317. States room is full even when empty. Sedation ineffective. The last line was barely legible. Room to remain sealed. I stopped reading. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the words. Sealed. I looked up slowly toward the dark hallway. I hadn't seen any rooms marked in the 300s yet, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The keys in my hand felt heavier again. I told myself I didn't have to check. I could stay at the desk, wait until morning. Leave when my shift was over and never come back. That would have been the smart thing, but the thought didn't settle. It kept slipping away like something was pushing against it. Room 317. The number stayed in my head. I stood up before I could change my mind. The flashlight beam shook slightly as I moved into the hallway again. My steps were slower now, more careful. The building felt different this time, more awake. I passed the west wing and moved back toward the center. There was a stairwell near the main hall. I hadn't checked it the first night. I hadn't needed to. Now, it felt like the only place left to go. The door to the stairwell was closed. When I pushed it open, the sound echoed down into the darkness below and up into the floors above. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing answered. I stepped inside. The air was colder here. Still, the kind of cold that doesn't move, doesn't breathe. My flashlight traced the steps as I started going up. One floor, then another. Each level looked the same. Narrow hallways, closed doors, faded numbers on the walls. When I reached the third floor, I saw it. A long corridor stretched out ahead of me. The numbers on the doors started at 301. My chest felt tight. I stepped forward slowly. The whispering came back. Not loud, not sudden, just there. Soft voices, layered over each other. Too quiet to understand, but closer than before. They seemed to follow me as I walked. The doors here were all closed, locked. I tried one as I passed. It didn't move. The further I went, the stronger the feeling became. Not fear exactly. Something heavier, like being watched from every side at once. I stopped in front of the next door. The number was faded, but still clear enough. This door was different. There was a metal plate bolted over the handle. Thick, old, rusted at the edges, sealed. I stood there, staring at it. The whispers grew quieter. Not gone, just waiting. My hand tightened around the keys. I don't know why I thought one of them would work, but I knelt down anyway, examining the plate. There was a small gap near the edge, just enough space to see part of the lock underneath. The metal didn't fully cover it, like it had been sealed in a hurry. I hesitated. Everything in me said to stop, to turn around, to go back downstairs, to forget I ever saw this door. But another feeling pushed against that. The same quiet pressure, the same sense that something was expecting me to do this. I reached out and touched the metal plate. Cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back slightly, then tried again, pushing harder this time. The plate shifted, just a little. A soft grinding sound filled the hallway. My breath caught. I froze listening. The whispers didn't return. The silence felt focused. I pushed again. The plate gave way with a slow, reluctant movement. One side came loose, hanging slightly. It hadn't been sealed as tightly as it looked. I slid it aside just enough to reach the lock. My hands were shaking now. I went through the keys one by one. The first didn't fit. The second didn't turn. The third clicked. The sound echoed louder than it should have. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark. My flashlight beam cut through the black slowly, revealing the space piece by piece. A bed, a chair, walls covered in marks. Not scratches this time. Writing. Every inch of the walls was filled with it. Words layered over each other, written again and again in different styles, different sizes. Some were small and careful. Others were large and uneven. I stepped inside without meaning to. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. My light moved across the walls. The same phrases repeated over and over. They're still here. Don't leave. It's full. They don't go. My chest tightened as I read. The whispers returned, but they weren't coming from the hallway anymore. They were coming from inside the room, all around me. Soft, calm, close. I turned slowly, shining the light in every direction. No one was there. The room was empty, but the voices, they weren't distant anymore. They felt near, too near, like they were standing just behind me, just out of sight. My breathing grew shallow. I know you're here, I said quietly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the whispering shifted. It became clearer, Not loud, never loud, but closer to words. I caught pieces. Back! See us. Stay. My light flickered once. I held it tighter, forcing it steady. The bed creaked softly behind me. I turned fast, heart pounding. The mattress dipped slightly, as if something had just sat down, but there was nothing there. The air above it looked wrong, like a faint distortion, barely visible, but enough. I took a step back. Then another. The whispers followed, not chasing, just surrounding. I moved toward the door, my legs feeling unsteady. As I reached it, I glanced back one more time. The room looked empty again. Still, quiet, but the feeling remained. It wasn't empty. It had never been empty. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut. The moment it closed, the whispers dropped away. Not completely, but distant again, like they had retreated behind the walls. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, room 317. My hands were still shaking. Slowly, I slid the metal plate back into place. It didn't fit as tightly as before, but it covered the handle. That felt like enough. For now, as I turned to leave, a thought settled quietly into my mind. Not loud, not forced, just there. The patients didn't leave. They stayed in their rooms, in their spaces, unseen, unheard, until someone opened the door. I walked back down the hallway, the number 317 still heavy in my thoughts. And somewhere behind me, from the other side of the sealed door, I thought I heard something new. Not whispering, not movement, something softer. A slow, patient knock from the inside. I didn't think much of the route when they first assigned it to me. It was just another night shift, another quiet line added to schedule. I had been working as a conductor for years by then, and most nights blended together. Same tracks, same stops, same tired passengers staring out the windows like they were waiting for something that never came. But this one was different, not because of the distance, not because of the train, because of the tunnel. They called it the Dreadmore Tunnel. Not officially, of course. On paper, it had a number, a clean, simple code like all the others. But no one used that name. Not the engineers, not the dispatchers, not even the older workers who had seen worse things than most. They all called it Dreadmore. I remember asking about it when I saw it on the schedule. The man in dispatch didn't look up right away. He just kept writing something down, slow and careful, like he didn't want to rush the moment. Then he said, "That line's been closed." I told him it was on my route. He nodded, still not looking at me. "Yeah," he said, "it's open tonight." There was something in the way he said it that didn't sit right. Why was it closed? I asked. That's when he finally looked up. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. His eyes just stayed on mine, steady and quiet. Then he said, "Accident." Just that. I waited for more, but it didn't come. How bad? I asked. He leaned back in his chair a little, like he was deciding how much to say. "Bad enough," he said. "Train went in. Didn't come out the same." I frowned slightly. What does that mean? He shook his head, like he regretted saying even that much. "Just follow the schedule," he said. "Don't stop in the tunnel. Don't open the doors. You'll be fine. You'll be fine." People only say that when they're not sure. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed for details. But the shift was starting, and I had work to do. So I let it go. That's how I ended up on that train, just before midnight, standing near the front carriage, watching the last few passengers board. It wasn't a busy night. Only a handful of people stepped inside. A man in a long coat who didn't say a word. A young woman holding her bag too tightly. An older couple who sat close together but didn't speak. Something about them felt off. Not wrong, exactly. Just quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. I checked their tickets, nodded, moved on. No one looked me in the eye. When the doors closed, the train let out a low, steady hum and began to move. At first, everything felt normal. The tracks clicked softly beneath us. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The outside world passed by in dark shapes and distant lights. I walked through the carriages, doing my usual checks. No one spoke. Not to me, not to each other. The silence stretched out, thin and long. I told myself it was just a late train. People were tired. That was all. But as we moved farther along the route, I started to feel it. That same quiet unease I've only felt a few times in my life. Like something was about to change. I made my way back to the front carriage and glanced out the window. The tunnel was ahead. You could see it from a distance. A wide, dark opening cut into the side of the hill. No lights around it. No signs. Just a black shape, waiting in the dark. Dreadmore. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the rail beside me. The train didn't slow down. It kept moving forward. Steady as always. I remembered what the dispatcher had said. Don't stop in the tunnel. Don't open the doors. Simple enough. As we got closer, I noticed something strange. There were no lights inside. Most tunnels had at least some kind of dim lighting. Emergency strips. Maintenance lamps. Something. This one had nothing. Just darkness. The kind that doesn't reflect anything back. The train entered the tunnel without a sound. No change in speed. No warning. One moment we were outside, and the next, the windows turned completely black. The lights inside the train flickered again. Once. Twice. Then they steadied. I let out a slow breath. It's just a tunnel, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I turned and looked down the carriage. The passengers were still there. Still sitting. Still silent. But something felt different. I couldn't place it at first. Then I noticed. They weren't looking out the windows anymore. They were looking straight ahead. Every single one of them. Perfectly still. I felt a small chill run through me. I walked closer. Everything all right? I asked, keeping my voice low. No one answered. Not even a glance. I took another step. That's when I saw their faces more clearly. There was no expression. No tiredness. No boredom. Nothing. Just stillness. I swallowed slowly and stepped back. Long tunnel. I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. No response. I move away. My steps a little faster now. The sound of the train on the tracks had changed. It was softer, almost like we weren't moving as fast anymore, even though I knew we were. I checked my watch. Only a minute had passed. It felt longer. I looked back out the window. Still nothing. Just black. No lights. No reflection. Not even the faint outline of the tunnel walls. That's when I realized something else. I couldn't see my own reflection. The glass should have shown something, even in low light. But there was nothing. Just darkness. A slow, quiet unease settled deep in my chest. I turned away from the window, and that's when I heard it. A soft sound. Not from the tracks. Not from the engine. From somewhere behind me. I turned slowly. One of the passengers had moved. Just slightly. Their head tilted to the side. Then, very slowly, they stood up. I watched as they stepped into the aisle. Their movements were smooth. Too smooth. Like they weren't quite used to standing. "Sir," I said. My voice felt tight. They didn't answer. They just stood there, facing me. The train kept moving. The darkness outside pressed against the windows. And for the first time since I started the job, I had a feeling I couldn't ignore. This wasn't a normal route. And whatever had happened in this tunnel, it hadn't ended. I told myself to stay calm. That's the first thing you learn working night routes. People act strange sometimes. They're tired, lost in their own thoughts, or just not in a mood to talk. You don't push. You don't ask too many questions. You just keep moving. So when the man in the aisle stood there without speaking, I tried to treat it like that, like it was normal. "Sir," I said again, softer this time, "please return to your seat." He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, facing me. I noticed something then, something small, but enough to make my chest feel tight. His eyes weren't focused on me. They were just open, like he was looking through me. Not at me. I took a slow step back. "All right," I said quietly. "Just be careful." My voice sounded strange in the carriage, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I turned away from him, forcing myself to walk back toward the front. I could feel him standing there behind me, not moving, not speaking. Just there, the tunnel stretched on, the train kept moving, and the darkness outside didn't change. I checked my watch again. 3 minutes. That wasn't right. The tunnel shouldn't be this long. I knew the route. I had seen the maps. Even with reduced speed, we should have been close to the exit by now. But the windows still showed nothing. Just that same flat, empty black. I reached the front carriage and rested my hand on the wall, steadying myself. Just a delay? I whispered. Just longer than usual. That had to be it. Old tunnel. Maybe something had changed. Maybe they rerouted part of it. There had to be an explanation. The train gave a soft shudder. Not enough to stop it, just enough to feel. Then, slowly it began to slow down. My breath caught. No, that wasn't supposed to happen. Don't stop in the tunnel. The dispatcher's voice came back to me, clear as if he was standing right beside me. I moved quickly toward the front window, trying to see anything ahead. Nothing. Still just darkness. The train slowed more. The sound of the tracks softened until it was barely there. And then it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever heard. No movement, no hum, just stillness. I stood there listening, waiting for something to happen, for the train to start again, for a signal, for anything. But nothing came. Then, slowly, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and dimmed. Not off, just lower. The air felt colder. I swallowed and turned around slowly. The carriage behind me was darker now. Shadows stretched longer across the floor. The passengers were still there, all of them, sitting, facing forward, except for one. The man who had stood up earlier was no longer in the aisle. My stomach tightened. I looked closer. He was back in his seat, sitting perfectly still, like he had never moved at all. I felt a quiet, creeping unease settle deeper into my chest. That's when I heard it, a sound from outside, soft, distant, like footsteps on gravel. I turned toward the door. The train wasn't supposed to be near any station, not inside the tunnel. There were no stops here, no platforms, but the sound grew clearer. Slow steps, coming closer. Then a faint light appeared through the window, not from inside, from outside, dim, flickering, like an old lamp. I moved toward the door, without thinking. Each step felt heavier. The light outside grew stronger, enough to show something beyond the glass. A platform, old, cracked, barely visible in the low light. My chest tightened. That wasn't on the map. There was no station here. There shouldn't be anything here. The train doors remained closed. I stood there, staring out. Shapes began to form in the dim light. Figures, standing on the platform, still, waiting. I couldn't see their faces clearly, just outlines, dark shapes against the weak glow of the lamps. They didn't move. They didn't signal. They just stood there. A long moment passed. Then, with a soft mechanical sound, the doors unlocked. I froze. No! I whispered. I hadn't touched anything. There was no reason for the doors to open, but they did, slowly, quietly. The gap widened just enough to let the cold air slip inside, and with it, something else, a stillness that didn't belong. The figures outside began to move, not fast, not sudden, just slow, steady steps toward the train. One by one, they boarded. I couldn't stop them. I didn't even think to try. I just stood there, watching. Each figure stepped inside without a sound. No footsteps, no breath, no words. They moved past me into the carriage and took empty seats. There were more of them than I expected, more than I remembered there being space for. But the seats filled, every one of them. I felt my chest rise and fall slowly, unevenly. Tickets! I said out of habit. The word slipped out before I could stop it. No one responded, not a single movement. I swallowed and stepped closer to the nearest one. "Sir," I said quietly. No answer. I leaned in slightly, trying to see his face. The light was dim, but enough. His skin looked pale. Not sick, not injured, just faded, like it didn't fully belong in the light. His eyes were open, but like the others, they weren't focused on anything. I stepped back slowly. My heart was beating faster now, but still quiet, like even it didn't want to disturb the air. I looked down the carriage. Every seat was filled, every passenger sitting the same way, still, silent, facing forward. Then, slowly, the doors closed. The soft click echoed through the train. The moment they shut, the outside light disappeared. The platform was gone. Just darkness again, like it had never been there. The train shuddered once more and began to move. I stood frozen in place as the sound of the tracks returned. Slow at first, then steady. The tunnel stretched on, endless. I turned slowly, looking at the passengers. More than before. Too many, and none of them spoke. None of them moved. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I noticed something else. Their heads, very slowly, almost too slow to see, they began to turn. Not all at once, one by one, until they were no longer facing forward. They were facing me, every single one of them. I felt the air leave my chest. No words came out, no sound, just that slow, quiet realization settling in. These weren't normal passengers. They hadn't boarded from any real station. And whatever place we had stopped at, it wasn't meant to be found. The train moved deeper into the tunnel. And I understood something I hadn't before. We hadn't just passed through that place. We had taken it with us. I stopped trying to understand it. That was the only way I could keep standing. If I thought too much about the platform, the passengers, the way their heads had turned all at once, I felt something inside me begin to slip, like my thoughts couldn't hold steady. So I focused on simple things. My breathing, the feel of the floor under my shoes, the quiet rhythm of the train moving forward again. That helped, a little, but it didn't change what I was seeing. Every seat was filled now, far more than before we entered the tunnel. And all of them, every single one was facing me, not moving, not blinking, just watching. I took a slow step back. No one reacted. No sound followed. I swallowed and forced myself to turn away. I couldn't stand there like that, not with all of them looking at me. I moved toward the front of the train, my steps careful, controlled. I didn't want to run. Running would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. When I reached the front carriage, I leaned against the wall again, closing my eyes for a moment. Just get through it. I whispered, just get through the tunnel. That's all I had to do. The tunnel would end eventually. It had to. I opened my eyes and looked out the front window. Darkness. Still the same. No light ahead. No sign of an exit. I checked my watch again. 15 minutes. That wasn't possible. The tunnel should have been behind us by now. Even at the slowest speed, we would have passed through long ago. But we hadn't. We were still inside. Still moving. Still surrounded by that same endless black. A quiet thought began to form in the back of my mind. What if the tunnel wasn't the same anymore? I pushed it away. That didn't make sense. Tunnels don't change. Tracks don't just go somewhere else. But the thought stayed. I turned slowly, looking back down the carriage. The passengers hadn't moved. Still facing me. Still silent. But something about them felt closer now. Not physically. Just present. Like the space between us had shrunk in some way I couldn't see. I took another step back. Then another. My shoulder brushed against something. I flinched and turned quickly. There was no one there, just the empty wall. But the feeling lingered, like I had almost touched something that didn't want to be noticed. My breathing grew slower, more careful. I couldn't panic. Not here. Not like this. I started moving again, this time toward the middle of the train. I don't know why. Maybe I thought being surrounded would feel less exposed. As I walked, I kept my eyes forward, trying not to look directly at the passengers. But I could feel them. Every step I took, I felt their attention shift. Following me, quiet, patient, I stopped halfway down the carriage. The air felt heavier here, harder to breathe. I looked up slowly. The passengers were closer. Not by much, but enough. Their seats hadn't changed, but the space between us felt tighter, like the train itself had narrowed. I pressed my hand against one of the seats beside me. Solid, normal, but everything else felt wrong. I forced myself to look at one of them. Just one. The man in the long coat. He was sitting near the window, his hands resting in his lap, his head tilted slightly, as if he was listening. His eyes were still open, but this time they moved just a little, enough to meet mine. My chest tightened. I couldn't look away. His lips parted slightly, slowly, like it took effort. And then in a voice so soft, I almost thought I imagined it, he spoke. Late. The word barely reached me. Thin, quiet, dry, but it was there. I felt something cold move through me. What? I whispered. He didn't answer. His lips closed again. His eyes stayed on mine. Then very slowly his head turned back forward. The others didn't move. Not yet, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The train gave a low, drawn-out sound as it continued forward. The darkness outside the window seemed thicker now, not just black, dense, like something you could almost touch. I stepped away from the seat, my legs feeling unsteady. Just a tunnel. I said again, softer this time, but the words didn't feel true anymore. I turned and walked toward the back of the train. Each step felt slower, heavier. The carriage stretched longer than I remembered. More rows of seats, more passengers. I was sure of it now. There were more than before. Too many. The train shouldn't have had this many seats. But it did. Or maybe it always had. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. That thought made something inside me twist. I reached the last carriage and stopped. The door at the end led nowhere. Just a small window, showing the same endless dark. I stood there, staring at it. My reflection should have been there. But it wasn't. Just the darkness. Then, slowly, something moved inside it. Not outside. Inside the glass. A shape, faint, forming where my reflection should have been. I stepped closer without thinking. The shape grew clearer. It looked like a person, standing where I was. But it wasn't me. It stood still for a moment. Then it raised its hand. I didn't move. My body felt locked in place. The shape pressed its hand against the glass from the other side. From the inside, I felt my breath catch. There was no other side. There was nothing beyond that window, just a tunnel. But the shape was there, waiting, watching. Slowly, very slowly, I raised my own hand. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if it would follow. Maybe I already knew. My hand moved toward the glass. Closer, closer, until my fingers almost touched it. The shape mirrored me perfectly. But just before our hands met, it stopped, its head tilted slightly. And then it smiled. Not wide, not sharp, just wrong. A quiet, empty kind of smile. I pulled my hand back quickly. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I stumbled back a step, my heart beating harder now. When I looked again, it was gone. The glass was empty. Only darkness remained. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, trying to understand what I had just seen. But nothing made sense anymore. Not the passengers, not the tunnel, not the train. I turned slowly, looking back down the carriage. Every passenger was standing now. I hadn't heard them move, not a sound, but they were all on their feet, facing me. The space between us was gone. They were close, too close, and for the first time, they all spoke. Not loud, not all at once, but together. A soft, layered whisper that filled the air. You're not passing through. My chest tightened. My legs felt weak. The train slowed again. The sound of the tracks faded. And then it stopped. The lights dimmed further, barely holding on. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, thick and unmoving. I stood there, surrounded, my breath shallow, my thoughts slipping. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The tunnel didn't lead anywhere. It didn't connect two places. It wasn't part of the route anymore. It was the route. And once you entered it, you didn't come out the same way. Or maybe you didn't come out at all. I didn't ask why they chose me. When the supervisor handed me the assignment, he didn't explain much. Just gave me a folder, a set of keys, and a location marked in faded ink. Routine maintenance, he said. Shouldn't take more than a few nights. I remember looking at the name written on the top of the page. Black Tide Lighthouse. It sounded older than it should have been, like something that had been around long enough for people to stop questioning it. Is it still in use? I asked. He shook his head once. Not officially. That word stayed with me. Not officially. I didn't press further. Jobs have been slow. Work like this didn't come often. Remote locations. Quiet tasks, most people turn them down. I didn't have that luxury. So I took the keys. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The road narrowed as I went, turning from pavement into cracked gravel, then into something that barely felt like a road at all. By the time I reached the coast, the sky was already starting to dim. The ocean stretched out in front of me, wide and still, reflecting the last of the fading light. There was no one else around. No boats, no houses, just the sound of water moving slowly against the rocks below. And out there, not too far from shore, the lighthouse. It stood alone on a narrow strip of land, connected to the coast by a thin path of stone and old concrete. The structure itself was taller than I expected. White once, maybe. Now it was worn down to a dull gray, streaked with years of salt and wind. The light at the top was dark. Had been for a long time, I guessed. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air smelled different here. Sharp, cold, carried by the sea. I stood there for a moment, just looking at the lighthouse. There was something about it. Not fear exactly, just a quiet feeling that I was arriving somewhere that didn't expect visitors anymore. I grabbed my bag and started walking down the narrow path. The sound of my footsteps echoed lightly against the stone. The ocean moved on both sides, slow and steady, like it didn't care I was there. As I got closer, I noticed how still everything felt. No birds, no insects, just the water. The front door of the lighthouse was already unlocked. That surprised me. I stood there, staring at it for a second, the keys still in my hand. Maybe someone had been here recently. Another worker. Someone checking things before I arrived. That made sense. It had to. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges gave a low, drawn-out creak. Inside, the air was thick. Not dusty, like most abandoned places. Just heavy, like it had been closed for too long. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The sound echoed up the narrow walls, rising higher than I expected. The interior was simple. A small entry room, bare walls, a staircase winding upward along the inside curve of the tower. Everything looked untouched. Not clean, but undisturbed. I set my bag down and took out the flashlight. The natural light from outside was already fading, and the inside of the tower seemed to swallow what little remained. I turned the beam upward. The staircase spiraled out of sight. I let out a slow breath. Just a few nights, I said quietly. My voice sounded smaller here. The folder the supervisor gave me had a list of things to check. Wiring, structural wear, the light mechanism at the top. Simple work. I picked up my bag again and started up the stairs. Each step made a soft sound under my weight. The air grew cooler as I climbed. The walls were close. Too close sometimes. The curve of the tower made it feel like the space was tightening as I went higher. I passed the first landing. A small room open to the side. Empty. Just a narrow window looking out at the sea. The glass was dirty, but I could still see the horizon. Nothing out there. Just water and sky blending into one. I moved on. The second landing was the same. Another empty room. Another window. Another view of the empty sea. By the time I reached the third level, the light outside had almost completely faded. My flashlight was the only thing guiding me now. The beam moved across the walls, catching small details I hadn't noticed before. Marks, faint lines scratched into the surface. Not deep, but enough to stand out. I paused, running my fingers lightly over one of them. It didn't feel like damage from weather. It felt intentional. I pulled my hand back slowly. Old place. I whispered. Things were down. That was easier to believe. I kept climbing. The sound of the ocean faded the higher I went, replaced by something else. A kind of silence that felt closed in, like the walls were holding it in. When I finally reached the top, I stopped at the door leading into the lantern room. It was slightly open. I didn't remember unlocking it. I stood there, my hand resting on the edge of the door. The air coming from inside was colder, not the kind of cold from outside. This was different. Still, unmoving. I pushed the door open slowly. The lantern room was larger than I expected. Glass windows surrounded the space, but most of them were too fogged or stained to see through clearly. The light mechanism stood in the center. Old, rusted, covered in dust. It hadn't been used in years. That much was obvious. I stepped inside, my flashlight moving across the room. At first, everything looked normal. Just old equipment, worn surfaces, nothing out of place. Then I noticed something. The floor, there were footprints. Faint, barely visible in the dust, leading in a slow circle around the center of the room. I felt my chest tighten slightly. They weren't mine. I had just arrived. I followed them with the beam of my light, round and round, endless, like someone had been walking in circles. For a long time, I stood there listening, the silence pressing around me. Then very softly, I thought I heard something, not from outside, not from below, from inside the room, a faint sound, like a slow breath. I turned quickly, shining the light in every direction. Nothing. The room was empty. The footprints stayed where they were. The air felt still, but the feeling didn't go away. That quiet sense of being watched. I moved toward the windows, trying to see outside. The glass was too clouded. All I could make out was darkness. No horizon, no water, just black. I stepped back slowly. The lighthouse didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt occupied, not in a loud way, not in a way I could prove, just present. I looked down at the footprints again, still circling, still endless, and for the first time since I arrived, I had the clear, quiet thought that maybe this place hadn't been left behind. Maybe it had just been left alone, waiting for someone to come back and turn the light on again. I didn't go back down right away. I told myself I should. The list in the folder started from the lower levels. Wiring, structure, foundation, all things that made more sense to check before climbing to the top. But I stayed in the lantern room. Maybe it was because of the footprints. Maybe it was because of that quiet feeling in the air. Or maybe it was something else I didn't want to admit. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the old light in the center of the room. It was bigger up close, taller than me, built from thick metal and clouded glass panels that hadn't been cleaned in years. It looked dead. That was the only way I could describe it, like something that used to have a purpose but didn't anymore. I set my bag down slowly and walked around it. The footprints curved around my path. Not broken, not disturbed. Whoever made them had walked in that same circle again and again and somehow left them untouched. I knelt down and pressed my fingers lightly against one of the marks. The dust shifted under my touch. Real, not old, or at least not as old as everything else in the room. I stood up again, my chest feeling tight. Someone's been here. I whispered. The words didn't sound right. Not in this place. I turned toward the door, thinking about going back down, about finishing the job as quickly as I could and leaving before morning. That would have been the smart choice. But as I stepped toward the door, something changed. It was small. So small I almost missed it. The air shifted, just a little. The kind of change you only notice because something inside you reacts before your mind does. I stopped. The room felt colder. Not all at once. Just slowly, like something unseen had moved closer. I turned back toward the center of the room. The light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint sound. A soft click. I froze. It came from the light mechanism. I stared at it, my breathing slow and shallow. That's not possible, I said under my breath. There was no power here. I had checked the wiring on the way up. Dead lines. No current. No sign of recent use. Another sound followed. A low hum. Barely there, but real. The metal frame of the light gave a slight vibration, like something inside it was waking up after a long sleep. I took a step back. No, I whispered. The glass panels around the center began to glow. Not bright, not at first, Just a faint, pale light growing slowly from within. I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as the light came to life on its own. No switches, no power, no reason. The glow spread outward, filling the lantern room with a soft, dim light that pushed back the darkness in a way that didn't feel right. It wasn't warm. It wasn't steady. It flickered slightly, like it was breathing. I felt my chest tighten. "Who's here?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded smaller than before. The light flickered once, then steadied. No answer came, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I turned slowly, looking toward the windows. The glass was no longer completely dark. The light from inside reflected back faintly, enough to show something beyond it, the ocean, but it didn't look the same. The water was too still, flat, like a surface without depth, and the horizon, it was gone, just darkness where the sky should have been. I stepped closer, my breath slow and uneven. "That's not right," I whispered. "The ocean never looks like that, not even at night. There's always something, movement, reflection, a line where the sky meets the water. But this looked empty, like the world outside had been erased." The light behind me grew brighter. I turned back toward it. The glow had strengthened, filling the room now, casting long shadows against the curved walls. The footprints on the floor looked different in this light, sharper, clearer, and there were more of them. I felt my stomach drop. They weren't just circling the center anymore. They were closer to the walls, closer to the door, closer to where I was standing. I hadn't seen them before. I was sure of it. I took a slow step back. My foot brushed against something. I looked down. A fresh mark, right where I had been standing. Not mine. It hadn't been there before. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "They're still here," I whispered without thinking. The words slipped out on their own. The light flickered again, stronger this time. The hum deepened slightly, filling the room with a low, steady sound that I could feel more than hear. I backed toward the door, my movement slow, careful. The footprints shifted again, not moving, just appearing, as if something unseen was walking in slow circles around me, keeping pace. My breathing grew tighter. "Stop," I said quietly. I don't know who I was talking to, but the words felt necessary. The hum grew louder for a moment, then softened again. The light dimmed slightly, then brightened, like it was reacting, listening. I reached the door and grabbed the handle. Cold, colder than anything else in the room. I hesitated, just for a second, then I pulled it open. The moment I stepped out into the stairwell, the air changed. Warmer, lighter. The hum faded. The glow behind me dimmed. I turned quickly. The light was still on, still glowing inside the lantern room, but softer now, quieter, like it had settled back into something less awake. I closed the door slowly. The click echoed down the stairs. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a slow step, then another, circling. I didn't wait. I turned and started down the stairs, my steps faster now, my breath uneven. The walls felt closer again, the air thicker. Every sound I made echoed too far, too long. By the time I reached the lower level, my hands were shaking. I stopped near the entrance and leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. "It's just the wiring," I said quietly. "Old system. Something triggered it." But the words didn't hold. Not after what I had seen. Not after the footprints. Not after the way the light had come on by itself. I looked toward the door. The ocean was still out there. The same quiet, empty stretch of water. But something about it felt different now. Like it wasn't just something to look at. Like it was looking back. I turned away and sat down near my bag. The folder lay open beside me. The list of tasks stared up from the page. Check the light mechanism. I let out a slow breath. I checked it. I whispered. But I hadn't. Not really. I had only watched it wake up. And as I sat there in the quiet, with the faint memory of that hum still in my ears, a thought settled slowly into my mind. The lighthouse wasn't broken. It was waiting. Waiting for night. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for someone to be there when the light turned on again. Because Whatever that light was meant to guide, it wasn't ships anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the lower level, sitting near the door, listening to the lighthouse breathe above me. That's the only way I can describe it now. It wasn't just a building anymore. It felt alive in a quiet, steady way. Not moving, not shifting, just existing with a kind of slow awareness. Every now and then, I could hear it, that low hum from above. Faint, almost gone. Then it would return again, like something turning over in its sleep. I told myself I wouldn't go back up. I didn't need to. The light was working. That was enough. I could write it down in the report, keep things simple, leave in the morning and never come back. That was the plan. But plans don't hold very well in places like that. Sometime after midnight, the air changed again. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying not to think about the footprints or the way they had appeared around me. That's when I noticed the smell. Salt, stronger than before, thicker, like the ocean had moved closer without making a sound. I lifted my head slowly. The door in front of me was still closed. Nothing had moved, but the smell kept growing. I stood up, my legs stiff, and walked toward it. Each step felt slow, careful, like I didn't want to disturb something I couldn't see. I reached for the handle and paused. For a moment, I just stood there listening. The ocean should have been the loudest thing outside. Waves, wind, something. But I didn't hear anything. Not even the water. Just silence. I opened the door. The night outside looked wrong. At first, I thought it was just the darkness. The kind you get when the sky is completely covered, no stars, no moon. But it wasn't that. It was thicker, heavier. And then I saw it. The fog. It wasn't there before. I was sure of that. When I arrived, the air had been clear. Cold, sharp, easy to see through. Now, the entire shoreline was covered in a dense, pale fog that stretched out over the water. It moved slowly, not drifting, not rolling, just shifting, like it was alive in its own quiet way. I stepped outside without thinking. The air was colder now, damp. It clung to my skin, to my clothes. I walked a few steps down the narrow path, my eyes fixed on the ocean. The fog covered everything. The horizon was gone again, just like before. But this time, I could feel it. The difference. The ocean wasn't just hidden. It was still, too still. I stood there, trying to listen. Nothing. No waves. No wind. Just that heavy silence pressing in from every side. Then, slowly, something changed. The fog began to glow. Faint at first. A soft, pale light spreading across the surface. I turned back toward the lighthouse. The top was shining. The beam had come on again, stronger than before. It cut through the fog in a slow, steady rotation, reaching out across the water. I watched it sweep across the surface. Once, twice. Each pass seemed to pull something out of the fog. Shapes, faint, just beneath the surface. My chest tightened. No, I whispered. I took a step closer to the edge. The fog shifted again, parting slightly where the light passed over it. And for a moment, I saw something. Not clearly, just enough to know it was there. Something large, just below the water. Still, waiting. The light passed again. This time, the shape was closer, rising, slowly. My breath caught. "That's not a ship," I said quietly. The words felt too small for what I was seeing. Another sweep of the light. More shapes. Not one, many, all beneath the surface. All moving, slow, careful, like they had been waiting for something to call them up. I stepped back, my heart beating harder now. The lighthouse behind me hummed softly. Steady, deliberate. The beam moved again, and the shapes responded. Each time the light touched the water, they rose a little higher, not breaking the surface. Not yet, just coming closer. My hands felt cold, too cold. I turned and looked up at the lighthouse. The beam wasn't random. It wasn't just spinning. It was searching, pausing for a fraction of a second in certain places, lingering, like it knew exactly where to look. And the things in the water, they knew where to be. A slow, creeping realization settled into my mind. The light wasn't guiding ships. It wasn't warning anything away. It was calling. I felt my chest tighten as that thought took hold. Stop. I whispered. I didn't know who I was speaking to. The lighthouse, the ocean, myself. But the beam kept moving. Steady, unchanging. The fog thickened around the edges, closing in slowly. The path behind me faded. The shore began to disappear. All that remained was a narrow strip of ground I stood on and the water beyond. I looked back out. The shapes were closer now, close enough that I could almost make out their form. Not smooth like fish, not solid like boats. Something else, something uneven, shifting. I stepped back again. My foot hit the stone path, grounded me for a second. I needed to leave. That thought came suddenly, clear and sharp. I needed to get back to the truck, drive away, forget this place. But as I turned, I saw the fog had already swallowed the path behind me. I couldn't see where it began, couldn't see where it ended. Just white, endless. My breath grew uneven. That's not possible, I whispered. I had just walked down that path. It hadn't been this long. It hadn't been this gone. Behind me, the lighthouse hummed louder. The beam swept across the water again. And this time, something broke the surface. Just for a second, a shape, dark, rising just enough to catch the light, then sinking back down. I felt my chest tighten. They were getting closer. Each time the light passed, they rose a little more, learning, following, responding. I turned back toward the lighthouse slowly. The door was still open, dark inside, waiting. I didn't want to go back in, but I didn't want to stay out there either. Not with the fog closing in, not with those shapes rising beneath the surface. The beam swept past me again, and for a moment, I felt it, a pull, not physical, but something in my chest shifted, like a quiet urge to step closer to the water, to look longer, to wait. I shook my head quickly. No, I said louder this time. The feeling faded slightly, but not completely. I backed toward the door, my eyes still on the ocean. The fog moved slowly. The shapes beneath it kept rising, and the light, it kept calling. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The sound echoed through the lighthouse. For a moment, everything was still again, but the hum remained, soft, steady, unchanging. I leaned against the door, my breath uneven, my thoughts trying to catch up. The lighthouse wasn't broken. It wasn't abandoned. It was working exactly the way it was meant to. And whatever was guiding, it wasn't lost. It was waiting, waiting in the dark water, watching the light above, and slowly, coming closer every time it turned. I drove past the town more times than I care to admit before I finally slowed down. The sun had already dipped behind the hills, leaving long shadows across the highway. My headlights cut through the dark, revealing the faint sign of a motel perched on the edge of the road. The sign read Blackwood Motel. The paint was peeling, and a single flickering bulb hung above the office, buzzing softly. I knew about the place before I even arrived. Some truckers whispered stories at gas stations. Locals spoke in half voices about guests who didn't return in the morning, or who left claiming they hadn't slept at all. I told myself it was nonsense. Everyone had a story. Everyone exaggerated. I was tired, had been driving for hours, and the next town was still 40 minutes away. The motel seemed quiet, and quiet was all I wanted. Just one night. That's all. I pulled up to the small gravel lot. The cars parked outside looked old, some rusted through, some with tires deflated. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and damp wood. I stepped out and felt the gravel crunch under my shoes, the sound oddly loud in the still night. The wind whispered through the trees behind the motel, carrying something I couldn't name. The office door was slightly open. I pushed it and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single yellow lamp on the counter. Behind it, an older man looked up at me. He was thin, with gray hair combed too neatly, and eyes that seemed too sharp for someone's age. Room, I asked, keeping my voice steady. Single, he replied, his voice low, smooth. For one night? Yes, I said. He nodded, then reached under the counter and handed me a key. Number 7, he said. First room on the right. Checkout is 11. Breakfast is optional. But eat early if you can. Thank you, I said. I couldn't place why his words made me pause. Something about the way he said, if you can, it wasn't a threat. Not exactly. But it lingered. The hallway leading to the room smelled of damp carpet and cleaning chemicals. The light above flickered, casting long shadows that stretched along the walls. I kept telling myself it was just old wiring, just an old building. That's all. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. The door was plain, paint chipped at the edges. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was small, furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a nightstand with a lamp. The sheets were neatly tucked. The room cleaner than I expected. I dropped my bag onto the bed and turned on the lamp. The light was dim, but enough to see. The air felt heavy, as if it had been waiting for someone to arrive. I shook my head. Tiredness. That's all it was. I was just tired. I took off my jacket and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was different from the highway outside. It wasn't empty. It was patient, waiting. I remembered the stories. Guess who couldn't sleep? People who left in the middle of the night. I told myself they were just rumors. Old motel, long nights, restless travelers. That was all. I pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal. That was expected. The area was remote, but the lack of connection added weight to the silence. No noise from the outside world. Just a room. Just me. I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes. Tried to ignore the small creaks and groans of the building settling. Tried to let the quiet lull me into sleep. But it didn't. The quiet pressed in instead, stretching the seconds into something heavier, slower. Then I heard it. A soft knock. Not loud. Just enough to catch my attention. I sat up, heart beating a little faster. The sound came again. From the wall next to the bed. Or maybe the ceiling. I couldn't tell. Just a soft, deliberate knock. Hello, I said, voice small in the empty room. Nothing. I stood up and walked toward the door. Hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the flickering lights above. No one there. I checked the window. The parking lot was empty. No cars. No movement. Just a faint flicker of the sign outside, swaying in the breeze. I went back to the bed, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Fatigue. That's all. Tired mind playing tricks. I lay back down, closed my eyes again, tried to breathe slowly, tried to sleep. Then I heard it again, a whisper this time, soft, faint, coming from the corner of the room near the dresser. Don't, it said. I froze. The room was empty, no one there, but the word lingered. Heavy, certain. I told myself it was the shadows, the old walls, the way the light flickered and made shapes on the floor. I closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing. 1, 2, 1, 2. The whisper came again. Stay. I sat up so fast I nearly hit the nightstand. My eyes darted around the room. The dresser, the bed, the corners, nothing. Empty. Silent. I stood up and moved toward the door, thinking maybe I should just leave. But the hall outside felt longer than I remembered. Shadows stretched along the walls in strange angles, as if reaching toward me. I stepped back into the room. The whisper was closer now, near my ear. Or maybe I imagined it. Sleep? It said, soft and patient. I didn't stay to figure it out. I grabbed my bag, shoved it over my shoulder, and opened the door. The hall was still empty, still quiet. I walked to the office. The older man wasn't there. The light above the counter flickered once, twice, and went out. I was alone. I wanted to leave, drive down the road until the town disappeared behind me. But something held me back. I couldn't explain why. The hall stretched longer than I remembered. The shadows moved with me, small shifts in the corner of my eyes, shapes that vanished when I looked directly. I returned to my room, sat on the bed, trying to convince myself to rest, tried to close my eyes, tried to ignore the weight in the air. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't matter anymore. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't awake. Just aware. The whispers returned. Patient, soft, faint like the hum of the old motel settling around me. And somewhere, deep in the silence, I understood This was why the stories existed. The Blackwood Motel didn't want guests. It wanted someone to stay. And I had come for just one night. That night, I realized the motel didn't care if I left. It wanted me to stay anyway. I could still hear it. Not a sound from the highway. Not a car passing outside. But something in the walls of my room. Soft, slow, patient. At first, I told myself it was a building settling. Old wood, shifting in the night. But that explanation didn't last. Not once the word started. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, the lamp dimmed low, trying to keep my eyes on the clock. Midnight, somewhere close, maybe later. Time didn't seem real anymore. Then I heard it, a voice, whispering, clear enough to understand. He shouldn't have done that. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The words were soft, almost like someone was practicing them before speaking out loud. But they carried weight, meaning, fear. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear more. She didn't mean it. Another voice joined, male, or maybe older, rougher. You shouldn't have left any witnesses. My stomach tightened. My hand shook slightly. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, just tired, just nerves. The motel, stories, all of it blending together. But the voices didn't stop. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The one next to the bed. The plaster was cold under my skin. I could hear the whispers clearer now. It's all here. Every lie. They'll find us. Never again. The words came and went in fragments. Not full sentences, just pieces. Enough for my mind to fill in the rest. Enough for me to imagine the crimes they described. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I stepped back from the wall. My chest was tight. I told myself to leave the room, to walk the hall, to open the door and run. But something held me there. A part of me wanted to listen, needed to understand. I sat back on the bed. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. The shadows stretched along the walls, long and thin. Quiet now, but alive, shifting, waiting. The voices returned. Different this time. Closer, louder. We buried her on the floorboards. He never saw us coming. I pressed my hands to my face, tried to block it out, tried to tell myself it was impossible. There was nothing in these walls except old plaster and studs. Yet I could hear it, every word, every confession, every small, terrible detail. I moved closer to the dresser, thinking about taking something to write it down, to prove it existed. But nothing in the room could hold these words. They weren't tangible, just memory, echoes of things that had happened here long before me. She screamed too loud. The money was hidden in the vent. Don't tell anyone. My hands trembled. I sat down again, forcing myself to breathe slowly. 1, 2, 1, 2. The voices grew more frantic, overlapping now. Male, female, young, old. They argued, pleaded, whispered threats. The crimes they described weren't all the same. Some were small, some were monstrous, but all of them carried the same weight. Pain, fear, regret. I couldn't tell if they were real, if they had really happened, or if the motel had found a way to trap them in the walls, to replay them endlessly for anyone who stayed too long. We were just trying to survive. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Listen to the walls. I shivered. My eyes scanned the room, the corners, the shadows. I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me, but the room stayed empty, silent, except for the walls. The walls that remembered everything. I pressed my hands to them again. Cold, hard, real. They'll come back. You can't hide from what's here. I staggered back. My head pounded. The words weren't leaving me, not even as I tried to walk away. They hung in the air, twisting, curling around me. I remembered the stories. Guests who didn't sleep. Guests who left in the middle of the night. Guests who claimed they could hear things through the walls. It wasn't the other guests. It was a motel itself. Every crime, every whisper, every mistake. Captured, trapped, preserved in the plaster and wood. Waiting for someone like me to arrive and listen. Stay. Listen. I sank to the floor. The lamp flickered. The shadows stretched toward me. I didn't care if I stayed awake or slept. I couldn't escape the voices. I tried closing my eyes, forcing myself to focus on breathing. 1, 2, 1, 2. The whispers continued. Patient, endless. The walls didn't judge. They only remembered. They only repeated. They only waited. You can't leave? They know what you did. Stay. I realized then that it wasn't just the past speaking. It was the present. The motel was alive in memory, in pain, in fear. Every crime that had ever touched these walls had left its mark, and I was part of it now. I lay back against the cold floor, staring at the ceiling, tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind. But the walls, they remembered everything, and now they were remembering me. I waited in the office for what felt like hours, though I couldn't say for sure if it was still the same night or the next morning. The lamp above the counter hummed faintly, casting long shadows across the walls, and the older man sat behind the desk, his hands folded neatly, watching me as if he'd been expecting me all along. I need to leave, I said quietly. My voice sounded small in the empty room. He didn't move, didn't blink for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. You think you can? I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He leaned forward slightly, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening in the dim light. You're tired. You've been here all night, listening to things that aren't meant to be heard. That's natural. Everyone hears them. The whispers, the walls, that's the motel. That's history. But some people, they never really leave. I blinked. His words sank slowly. My stomach tightened. What are you talking about? He smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was patient, deliberate. Some guests, he said softly. Check out. They walk out the door. They drive away. They leave their bags, their belongings, and they return to the world outside. But they don't really leave. Not entirely. I shifted in my seat, my pulse quickening. I don't understand. He leaned back again, folding his hands in his lap. They stay in the walls, in the rooms, in the air, in the dust. Pieces of them remain. Echoes, like the others you've been listening to. Past guests, people who stayed too long, people who listened too closely, people who couldn't let go. I swallowed hard. The hairs on my arms stood up. You're saying I'm stuck? He shook his head slowly. Not yet, not fully, but his eyes drifted toward the ceiling, then back to me. The longer you listen, the more you become part of the story. And then the motel remembers you. And it waits. It waits for the next person who arrives. Someone curious, someone tired, someone who wants just one night. I felt my throat tighten. My hands gripped the edge of the counter. This isn't real, I whispered. It can't be real. The man's gaze held mine steadily. Do you hear them? He asked. I did. Faintly, from the walls around me. Soft, broken whispers. Voices I didn't recognize, yet somehow felt familiar. Words from the past. Accusations, apologies, confessions. Pieces of lives that had passed through the motel over decades, preserved in the plaster and wood. Yes, I said, I hear them. He nodded slowly. Then you know, you were never just a guest here. You were always part of the history, even before you arrived. I shivered, realizing the words weren't metaphorical. They weren't a warning. They were a statement. Something deep and fundamental. Before I arrived, I asked, my voice cracking. How could that be? He leaned forward again, voice soft, almost a whisper. Some people return, not in body, not in memory, but in presence. Sometimes the motel chooses. Sometimes it doesn't matter. But every guest leaves a mark. Every guest becomes part of the walls, the air, the floors. You walked in tonight, thinking it was just a place to rest, but the place had already been waiting for you. I tried to shake my head, tried to make sense of it. I just wanted a room, just one night. That's all. The man's hands flexed lightly on the desk. That's all anyone wants when they come here. But the motel doesn't care about intentions. It cares about presence. And now, his gaze didn't waver. You are present, fully, and it remembers. I swallowed again, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. I thought about the whispers through the walls, the voices I had heard that night, recounting crimes, regrets, moments of fear, moments of despair. And now I understood. They weren't echoes in the sense I had assumed. They weren't just recordings of the past. They were guests who never left. People who became part of the motel itself, lingering in the rooms, in the air, and the walls, until they were almost indistinguishable from the building. I took a step back. The office seemed smaller, the shadows closer, the hum of the lamp louder. I wanted to run, to leave, but something held me in place. The stories, the whispers, the weight of all those who had come before. "You can leave," the man said softly. "You can walk back to your car. You can drive away." But he paused, letting the words stretch in silence. "You'll be back, not necessarily in body, not necessarily in memory, but you'll return. This place, it never forgets." I stared at him, heart hammering. The motel felt alive now, patient and watchful. The walls seemed to breathe subtly, expanding and contracting in time with the soft murmurs of voices that rose and fell around me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The older man smiled faintly. Some guests stay for a lifetime, without ever realizing it, and some leave a little too much behind. I felt a chill creep down my spine. My thoughts swirled, memories of the night pressing in. Every whisper, every shadow, every flicker of the lamp. It wasn't just a motel being old or strange. It was alive in a way I couldn't define, alive with every guest who had ever stayed. And now it had me too. I thought about the room I had occupied, the bed, the dresser, the walls that had spoken to me, the quiet patience of the building, waiting and remembering. Every creak, every sigh of the old structure had been more than with settling. It had been the building interacting with me, pulling me into its history. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Why does it do this?" The man leaned back, hands folded once more. "Because it can. Because it remembers. Because every guest leaves a part of themselves behind, willingly or not. And some don't even know they are leaving it. And when enough pieces gather, the motel becomes more than just a building. It becomes a keeper." I tried to imagine it. The motel is a keeper, not a caretaker, not an owner, not a building. A living memory, a collector, a presence that existed through every whisper, every mark, every guest who had lingered too long. I sat down slowly in the chair across from him. My head felt heavy, my hands cold, my heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't belong to me anymore. You knew," I said finally. "You knew this about everyone, about the stories, about the people who never left." He nodded. "I do. Some guests come and go. Others stay. That's the way it has always been. Always will be. And you've been here before in ways you might not remember. That's why you hear them, why you feel them. The walls recognize you. Because you've been part of this place longer than you realize." The words sank slowly, and I realized I was trembling. My legs felt heavy, my chest tight. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step out the door and drive down the empty highway and never look back. But deep inside, I knew I wasn't just a guest. I was part of the motel's memory. I had always been here, even before I arrived that night. The lamp above us flickered once, twice, and hummed low. Shadows stretched along the office walls. The silence settled, patient, waiting, filled with voices that I had begun to recognize. Voices of past guests, murmuring in plaster, the wood, the air itself. And I understood something I couldn't unhear. The motel didn't want visitors. It wanted witnesses. It wanted participants. It wanted to remember. And now it had me. "You can leave," the man said again quietly, "but some part of you will stay, just like the others. And someday you'll return, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in a whisper, perhaps in the walls themselves. You were here before. You will be here again. The motel never forgets." I leaned back, trying to breathe. The room felt too small, the walls too close, the hum of the lamp too loud. Outside, the night pressed in thick and waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that pressed cold into my chest, that I would never truly leave. Not really. The Blackwood Motel had claimed me, as it had claimed so many before. And some part of me would linger here forever, whisper in the walls, waiting for the next guest who thought they were only staying for one night. I first heard about the hikers when I found the old police report tucked between other files at the local archives. The folder was yellowed, the pages brittle at the edges, and the handwriting inside had that careful, precise tone that made you think the officer had already given up hope of solving the case. 3 hikers disappeared in the gray pine forest. No trace, no bodies, no explanation. Just gone. It was the way the report described the forest that grabbed me first. Not dense in the usual way, but quiet, almost unnatural. Officers wrote about how the trees seemed to absorb sound, how the wind moved strangely through branches, and how animals appeared to avoid the area entirely. I had to see it for myself. I couldn't help it. I packed lightly. A notebook, my recorder, a flashlight, water. No fancy gear. I wasn't planning to climb mountains or rappel down cliffs. I just wanted to see the place, to feel it, to walk where the hikers had last been seen. The drive out was long. The gray pine forest sits miles away from the nearest town, and the road winds in ways that make the journey feel endless. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. Shadows stretched long across the gravel parking lot. A single rusty sign read, "Gray Pine Forest. Enter at your own risk." I laughed at the sign, but it didn't feel like a joke. Not here. Not in this quiet place where the wind didn't rustle the trees the way it should. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was cooler than I expected, sharp and crisp, carrying a faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I took a deep breath and checked my map. The trailhead where the hikers had started was only a few hundred feet in. It should have been simple. But something in the forest made me pause. The trees were taller than I imagined, their trunks thick and dark, and the shadows between them stretched like fingers across the forest floor. I could hear the faint scurrying of animals, but no birds. Not a single bird. It felt wrong. I started walking. My boots crunched against the fallen needles. Each step echoed in the quiet. Though the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the sound. I tried to focus on the trail, the broken branches, the faint markers left by park rangers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something waiting. I stopped at the first clearing, the place marked in the report where the hikers had taken a break. I could almost imagine them there. 3 young people, backpacks heavy, laughter cutting through the silence. And then, nothing. I set up my recorder, speaking softly into it. I'm here at the Gray Pine Forest, the spot where the hikers were last seen. No one else is around. The forest is quiet, too quiet. I walked further, following the narrow trail. Every now and then, I thought I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, perhaps shifting between the trees. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing, just the forest. Still, patient, waiting. The deeper I went, the more the air changed. It wasn't colder exactly, but thicker, dense, like walking through invisible mist. I could feel it pressing against my chest, slowing my breaths. I tried to shake the feeling, focus on the trail, focus on the facts. 3 hikers disappeared. No signs of struggle, no clues, just gone. I reached a small stream. The water was dark, almost black in the fading light. I knelt down and touched it. Cold, still, nothing stirred. No fish, no insects, nothing. Just a reflection of the darkening sky above. I remember the last line in the police report. The forest seems to take them. Whatever enters doesn't leave the same. I laughed quietly, nervously. The idea of a forest that takes people was absurd. Superstitious nonsense. But still, a part of me felt the truth in the words. I followed the stream further, letting it guide me. The trail faded. The markers grew sparse. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that swallowed the last of the sun. Shadows pulled around the roots of trees, thick and uneven, as if the earth itself had dark pockets waiting for something to fall in. Then I saw it, a set of footprints, barely noticeable at first, pressed into the soft soil beside the stream. They were small, too small to be mine. They were not recent, but not old either, fresh enough that I could see the impressions of the toes, the heels. I followed them carefully. The prints led me to a hollow in the forest. a circle of trees, twisted and gnarled, forming a natural wall around the center. The ground inside was different, disturbed, leaves trampled, soil soft. A faint smell lingered, earth damp pine and something metallic I couldn't place. Blood? Rust? I wasn't sure. I stepped carefully into the hollow, notebook in hand. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating roots and rocks, the soft decay of fallen leaves. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, almost impossible to hear. A voice soft, distant, yet right beside me. Help us? I froze. My chest tightened. My flashlight shook in my hand. I called out softly. Hello? Anyone there? Silence. Then the whisper again. Don't leave. My heart pounded. The forest was silent. But the words had come from somewhere inside. Not the trees. Not the wind. Something else. Something inside the hollow. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back to my car, to the road, to safety. But curiosity held me in place. I had to know. I had to see. I crouched low, moving closer to the center of the hollow. The whispers grew fainter, almost like the forest was swallowing them. The soil under my hands felt alive, pulsing slightly beneath my fingers. Then I saw a mark, a shallow depression, circular, about the size of a small grave. The earth looked disturbed, as if something had been buried there recently. I pressed my hand against it, cold, damp, solid beneath the surface. And then I felt it, movement, very slight, like something shifting just under the soil. I jumped back. My flashlight swung, catching the trees in sharp angles. The hollow seemed larger now, more oppressive. Shadows curling around me. The whisper came again, louder this time. Stay with us. I stumbled backward, heart racing. My mind spun. The hikers, their disappearance, the police report, the whispers, the forest. I ran, not carefully, not softly. I ran toward the faint light of the trailhead, toward the fading road, toward anything familiar. The footprints behind me seemed to follow, echoing each step I took. Branches scratched at my arms, roots caught my feet. But I didn't stop. Finally, I broke through the edge of the forest. The parking lot appeared ahead, empty, silent. My car, my keys. I reached them and jumped inside, doors locking behind me. The forest stood still behind me, silent, watching, patient, even as I drove away, headlights cutting through the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had followed me, that the whispers had followed, that the missing hikers weren't gone at all. Not really. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing. Shadows in the shape of people. Waiting. Patient. Always waiting. I realized then that some places don't let go. Some disappearances aren't about being lost. They're about being remembered. And sometimes the forest remembers far too well. I drove on, but the whispers stayed with me. Soft. Endless. Patient. Waiting for the next traveler, who thought they were only passing through. I sat in my small rented room. The door closed tight against the evening wind. The forest behind me seemed quiet, but I could still feel its presence, like a shadow that lingered just beyond sight. I pulled the recorder out of my bag and placed it carefully on the table. The tapes were old, yellowed, the labels written in cramped handwriting. Gray Pine Hikers, tape 1, 2, 3. I pressed the play button. The mechanical whirring filling the room, breaking the stillness. And then I heard them. Voices. Clear, young, familiar. 3 voices talking softly, casually, as if they were in the middle of a normal hike. But there was something wrong. The first tape started with laughter, soft and bright, cutting through the static. Hey, did you see that? One voice said. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the faint splash of a stream. It sounded like the hikers I had imagined, the ones I had followed into the forest in my own mind. But as the tape continued, the words began to shift, subtly at first. I think we went too far. One said, almost a whisper, are we lost? The second voice laughed nervously. No, it's fine. I mean, we've been through worse. Right? I felt my stomach tighten. The tone was casual, normal, but layered under was something else. Something patient. something that carried the weight of something unseen. Then the third voice spoke, quieter than the others. It's getting late. Maybe we should find a spot to rest. And that was when I realized they weren't recording these themselves. These were not found tapes from their trip. The date on the recorder, the timestamp of the playback, didn't match when they had been hiking. This tape was made days after they had vanished. I leaned closer, heart pounding. The voices were calm, almost mundane, yet the context made it impossible. How could they be speaking if they were gone? I think someone is watching us, the second voice said softly. Not panicked, not scared, but observant, careful, almost as if aware of a presence I couldn't sense. They said it's just a forest, the first voice replied. Don't let it get in your head. I pressed pause. My hands were trembling. I stared at the tape deck, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had edited the tapes, splicing in recordings of their voices. But the cadence, the inflection, the natural pauses, they didn't feel faked. They felt alive. I pressed play again. The next segment opened with silence, a long stretch of it, filled only with a faint creak of branches. Then the whisper started, faint at first, impossible to make out. Then words formed. We can't leave. They'll take us if we go. Stay here. I froze. My hands gripped the edges of the table. The words weren't the hikers speaking, but they were in their voices. Distorted, unnatural, but unmistakably them. I pressed pause and exhaled shakily. My mind tried to find reason. Maybe some kind of trick with the equipment. A recording played backwards, maybe, or some old forest sounds layered under their laughter. But deep down, I knew these weren't recordings from before they disappeared. These were recordings from after. I pressed play again, my fingers shaking. The trees remember everything. Don't wander too far. We're still here. My stomach turned. I could hear them walking, or at least the sound of feet brushing leaves, soft shuffles, the occasional snap of a twig. But no human should have been there. I had followed the trails myself. Days after they vanished, no one was supposed to be there. The tape continued, voices overlapping now. Their casual chatter mixed with whispers that weren't theirs. Something else was answering them. Something patient, observant. It knows where we are, the third voice said, almost resigned. We can't fight it. Maybe we were never meant to leave. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I leaned back in a chair, trying to breathe slowly. 1, 2, 1, 2, but I couldn't stop listening. Each tape pulled me further and deeper into the forest I could no longer touch, into the space between life and disappearance. The voices were calm, even casual at times, but every segment carried this quiet dread. Something had waited for them, something that had continued the conversation after they vanished. I noted every detail in my notebook, every pause, every inflection, every phrase that seemed to echo beyond reason. The forest wasn't just a place. It wasn't just missing hikers. It was aware, patient, watching, waiting, and somehow, impossibly, it was recording everything, replaying it on these tapes for anyone who dared to listen. It's hungry. We tried to leave, but we never could. I realized then that the tapes were more than evidence. They were proof that something existed beyond normal understanding, something that could extend time or presence or memory beyond the physical. The hikers weren't just missing. They were still here, not in body, not entirely, but in sound, in memory, in whatever had claimed them in the forest. I turned off the tape, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. The wind outside rattled the window panes, and I could swear I heard faint steps on the wooden floor, though no one was there. I sat in the dim light, notebook open, hands trembling. The tapes had shown me a truth I wasn't sure I could face, that the forest didn't just take people. It preserved them. It continued their voices, their conversations, long after they were gone. And as I sat there, the quiet pressing around me, I understood that listening came with a price. The forest, the tapes, the voices, they didn't just reveal the story. They pulled you into it. They made you part of it. And I knew, with a certainty that weighed down my chest, that once you listened, once you truly heard the missing, you were never the same again. I stayed in that small cabin on the edge of gray pine forest longer than I should have. The tapes had drawn me in, each one a thread pulling me deeper, and I couldn't stop. I told myself it was research, that I was documenting the hiker's story. But the truth was darker, quieter, and insidious. I wasn't just listening anymore. I was being watched, studied, and, in a way I couldn't name, mirrored. It started when I returned to the forest, notebook and recorder in hand. The sun was low, painting the trees in pale gold, and the shadows stretched across the trail in shapes that seemed wrong, too long, too deliberate. I followed the narrow path where the hikers had last been recorded, the same way I had before, but this time I noticed details I hadn't seen. Broken twigs, faint depressions in the soft soil, moss pressed flat as though someone or something had passed recently. I paused, listened, a voice carried from deep in the trees. Soft, familiar, almost comforting. "Did you bring the water?" I froze. My heart pounded. That was the second hiker's voice from the tapes. Not my memory of them. Not an echo in my mind. The sound came from somewhere in the forest. Alive. Real. I told myself it was impossible. There was no one there. The forest was empty. Just me. And yet, the voice came again, clearer this time. "We should rest here for a while." I could hear the faint shuffle of leaves, the soft breaking of branches. But I saw nothing. No shadows moving between the trunks. No figure stepping into the thin light. Only the forest, patient, still, watching. I took a cautious step forward, my boots pressed against the soft earth. But the voice didn't stop. It responded to me, almost conversationally, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. I swallowed hard. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice small. The voice answered, calm, matter of fact. "We're right here. You can come closer." I wanted to run. Every rational part of me screamed to leave. But curiosity, dangerous, irresistible curiosity, kept me rooted. I moved forward slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dusk, illuminating the gnarled roots and twisted trunks. The air was thicker now, heavy with the scent of damp pine and something else. Metallic. Iron maybe, or blood. I didn't know. Then it hit me. The voices weren't just present. They weren't just echoes. They were perfect imitations. Every hesitation, every breath, every slight inflection, exactly as it had been on the tapes. It was as if the forest had learned them, memorized them, and now it was speaking them back, mimicking the hikers in a way that was too precise, too deliberate to be coincidence. A third voice joined in, the youngest sounding one. "Don't be afraid. We're safe here." Safe. The word twisted in my chest. Safe in a place where the missing had never truly returned, where the forest swallowed people whole and preserved only their voices. I realized then that the forest didn't just take. It observed. It learned. It repeated. And when it repeated, it imitated perfectly. So perfectly that the line between what was real and what was created blurred completely. I stepped off the trail, trying to move closer to the sound. Each voice called out, responding to my movements, adjusting. I could feel the air around me pulse subtly, as if the forest itself were breathing, alive, aware. It wasn't just trees and soil anymore. It was a creature patient, intelligent, and infinitely quiet when it needed to be. I pressed record, hands trembling, though I knew what I would capture would not be proof to anyone else. Only proof for me, and the recorder picked up the voices, yes, but not in the way I expected. They sounded distant, layered over something deeper. A hum, a rhythm, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. "Follow us," the voices said, almost as one. "It's okay," another whispered. "We're still here." I realized I was standing in the hollow where I had found the footprints before. The ground seemed softer, almost pulsing beneath my feet. I knelt, pressed my hands into the soil, and then I heard it beneath me. A faint whisper, not from the air, not from the trees. Beneath, from the earth. "Don't leave us." My chest tightened. The ground was alive in ways I couldn't describe. The forest didn't just mimic voices. It absorbed them, integrated them. And it was patient, slow, deliberate, replaying every tone, every inflection, learning from the living presence of the visitor who dared to listen. I stumbled back, flashlight swinging. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, stretching across the hollow like long fingers. Every rustle in the underbrush sounded like footsteps, but I saw no one. I could feel eyes, though, small, patient, hidden in every knot of bark, in every dark space between trees, watching me, learning me. You can join us. The voice was unmistakable now. It mirrored my own tone, almost perfectly, but not quite. The forest had learned to mimic me. The recordings had taught it. The whispers in the walls of the forest had taught it. It repeated what it had heard. But it also adapted, learned, anticipated. I felt a chill so deep it reached my bones. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet my feet barely moved. I had come seeking answers, seeking truth, and the truth was worse than anything I had imagined. The forest was not empty, not silent. It was alive in ways I couldn't define, replicating voices, mimicking people, and eventually it would mimic me too. I turned to leave, but the trail seemed wrong. The trees had shifted. Branches formed walls that weren't there before. Roots tangled across the path like deliberate snares. I took a deep breath, tried to follow the way I had come, but every step brought me deeper into the hollow, deeper into the mimicry of sound and presence. You're here again. The voice was mine, or it sounded like mine, not from my lips, but from somewhere else, a shadow of myself, replaying every step I had taken, every word I had said, every breath I had drawn. I ran then, through the underbrush, branches scratching my arms, roots catching my feet. The voices followed, echoing my own words, my own thoughts, repeating them, layering them over each other until I could no longer distinguish reality from mimicry. I broke through the edge of the forest at last, panting, the air light and open. The sun had fallen completely, leaving only dust behind. I glanced back toward the hollow, and I thought I saw shapes moving just inside the trees. Shadows that weren't quite human, but carried the exact rhythm of human speech. I knew then that the hikers weren't gone. Not entirely. They were here, and the forest had learned them perfectly. And if it could learn them, it could learn anyone. It could learn me. I walked to my car, hands still shaking, the recorder pressed against my chest. Every creak of the car seat, every rattle of the wind sounded like a voice. And when I glanced at the recorder, the faint static in the playback seemed to whisper back to me in the sound of my own voice. The gray pine forest had learned me. It had learned them, and it would wait for the next person who thought they were just visiting. Because once it learns, it never forgets. I arrived at the hospital just before midnight. The parking lot was almost empty, save for a few night shift cars huddled near the main entrance. Streetlights flickered in the cold wind, casting long, thin shadows across the cracked asphalt. The building itself felt tired, like it had been waiting for anyone, to notice it was still here. I swiped my ID at the security desk, the beep echoing in the mostly empty lobby. Half the hospital had been shut down for months, wings closed, rooms locked, hallways dark. My assignment was simple: patrol the remaining sections, check doors, monitor cameras, and call in if anything unusual happened. Simple, easy, quiet hours. The night manager gave me a quick nod before leaving. Just a heads up, he said. Most of the staff avoid this wing at night. Just keep an eye out. I smiled politely. He didn't need to know I was already uneasy. Something about the hospital at night felt different. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, flickering in a rhythm that made my stomach tighten. Every time I passed a shadowed hallway, it seemed longer than it should be, stretching away from me. I started my rounds. The first floor was mostly empty, rooms locked, beds stripped, monitors unplugged. The faint hum of the emergency generators was the only sound besides my footsteps on the polished floors. Occasionally, I'd hear a soft clang, a door swinging slightly from draft, but nothing unusual. Not yet. By the time I reached the second floor, I noticed it. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, almost aware. I passed by the nurse's station, abandoned for months, and the papers left on the counters trembled slightly, as if someone or something had brushed against them. I shook my head. Air conditioning, drafts, Logical explanations. That's all it was. I moved on, keying doors as I went. Most were locked tight. Others were blocked with caution tape, a reminder that the hospital's full closure had been sudden. As I walked, the echo of my boots seemed to multiply, bouncing off walls I thought were too far apart for sound to travel that way. I tried not to notice, tried not to feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was when I reached the end of the hallway that I first heard it clearly, a soft, almost imperceptible voice coming from one of the closed rooms. I stopped, flashlight trained on the door. Nothing, just a sterile, quiet darkness behind the frosted glass. I whispered into the empty corridor. "Hello?" No answer. I stepped closer. The voice came again, faint, distorted almost like it was a memory of sound rather than a live voice. "Help me?" I froze. My stomach dropped. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. I shook my head. I wasn't hearing things. Hospitals are full of odd noises at night. Pipes, machines, the occasional night janitor. It was nothing. That's all it was. I kept moving, trying to shake off the feeling. I told myself to focus on routine, check doors, record times, report any irregularities. My mind wanted logic. My body wanted to run. The hallway grew colder as I progressed. Not a change in temperature. More like the cold pressed against me, intangible but undeniable. My flashlight's beam caught on a chair in the corner. For a second, I thought someone was sitting there, hunched over, waiting, but the chair was empty. I passed by the room again. The voice returned, clearer this time, almost a whisper in my ear. "Don't leave." I stopped completely. I told myself I was imagining it. Fatigue, shadows, echoes. I had been up late, and the hospital had that effect. People talk about haunted hospitals as if it's folklore. I tried to reason with myself. I continued my patrol, but the voice followed. Soft murmurs drifting from different rooms, always at the edge of hearing. Sometimes the words made sense. Sometimes it was just syllables strung together, the cadence human but the meaning alien. In one empty ward, I found a patient chart left on a counter. The name was faded, written years ago, a reminder of someone who had been here long before I arrived. I picked it up. The papers shifted slightly in my hand, as if responding to me. I set it back down carefully. By the third floor, the quiet had grown almost unbearable. The hum of the air system became a constant whisper in my ears. Every door I passed seemed to exhale as I walked by. I could feel presence behind each corner, waiting, patient, not threatening, just observing. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped at the janitor's closet. The handle rattled softly. I could hear a faint scraping, like someone dragging their hand along the floor. My grip tightened on the flashlight. Nothing moved when I opened the door. Just mops and buckets, ordinary cleaning supplies. Yet the air inside felt heavier, and I could swear I heard breathing, shallow and uneven. I kept notes as I moved to the hospital, writing carefully in my notebook every irregular sound, every odd shadow, every whisper. I needed evidence. I needed proof. Anything to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Hours passed. My rounds continued. The building's old sections moaned with age. The elevators shuddered as if remembering their own past trips. Occasionally, I thought I saw a figure dart past the stairwell, but every time I turned, the corridor was empty. At one point, I paused in the lobby again, listening. The silence here was different. Not the quiet of emptiness. Not the quiet of a sleeping building. This was the quiet of watching, of waiting. I could almost feel it breathing around me, a patience I couldn't name. And then, near the nurse's station, I heard it clearly for the first time. Laughter, soft, distant, and yet impossibly close. A child's laugh, but there were no children in this hospital anymore. There hadn't been for years. "Come play with us?" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was a recording left behind, maybe a training tape or a leftover audio from the pediatric wing. But there was no equipment, no speakers, nothing, just the building, and the quiet, patient watchfulness of it. I moved toward the stairwell, flashlight scanning every corner. The laugh echoed again, fading into a whisper as if carried by the air itself. Don't leave. By the time my shift was halfway done, I realized I wasn't patrolling anymore. I was navigating the building like a guest in someone else's home. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper dictated my path. I could no longer distinguish normal noises from the impossible. When morning finally approached, I was exhausted, not just from walking, but from the pressure of the quiet, from the weight of the observation, from the lingering feeling that the hospital remembered everyone who had ever walked its halls, even those who had left, especially those who had left. I stepped outside as the first weak light of dawn broke the horizon. The cold air felt normal again, almost comforting, but I knew it wouldn't last. When night fell, the quiet hours would begin again, and the building would wake, waiting, patient as always. I didn't know what I had seen or heard was real, but I knew one thing. Some buildings don't just house the living. Some remember the lost. And the Grayfield Hospital, with half its wings closed and lights dimmed, remembered far too well. I returned to Grayfield Hospital the next night, still shaken from my first shift. The memory of whispers and that soft, childlike laughter haunted me, replaying the quiet moments when I thought I was alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was exhaustion, imagination, the building settling. But deep down, I knew the hospital remembered, and tonight, I had a feeling it wanted me to notice something else. The lobby was empty when I arrived, just as it had been before. I signed in, checked the cameras, and began my rounds. My flashlight swept over the dusty floors, reflecting off the polished linoleum in sharp streaks. I passed the old elevators and stairwells, hearing nothing unusual at first. The hum of the night shift machines was steady and predictable. I made my way to the wing that had been partially reopened for occasional outpatient treatments. Most of the rooms were empty, doors closed, but as I rounded the corner near room 212, I froze. A figure stood by the window, tall, thin, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the dim light. They weren't moving, just standing, looking out into the darkness beyond the glass. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward them. "Hello," I called softly, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. My instincts told me to step closer, but something in my chest tightened. A low, unnatural dread pressed against my ribs, urging me to wait. Then the figure turned. Their eyes were blank, wide, reflecting nothing. Their lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear. I strained to catch it. "Are you a patient?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head slightly. Then, as if hearing me, it took a single step forward. I realized something I didn't want to believe. This person didn't belong here. There were no records, no files, no history. I checked the clipboard outside the room, the digital logs in the security system. Nothing. I blinked uncertain. Could it be a mistake? A new patient who hadn't been entered into the system yet? But even that felt wrong. The air around them seemed too still, almost too quiet, like the space itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to speak. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't answer. But as I looked closer, I noticed small details that made my stomach tighten. Their clothes were old-fashioned, worn, and clean in a way that didn't belong to the hospital's current laundry. The scent around them was faint, like mildew and cold air, a mixture that reminded me of the abandoned wings I patrolled the night before. I stepped closer, flashlight shaking. "What's your name?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it whispered again, just barely audible. "Don't leave." A chill ran down my spine. That phrase, the same one I'd heard on the first night, echoed again, carried through the hallway as if the building itself repeated it. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a patient traumatized, someone who had been moved without files. But the stillness, the way they floated slightly above the floor as they shifted closer, it wasn't human, not entirely. I moved back slowly, trying to give myself space. "I'm just here to make sure you're okay," I said, keeping my voice calm. "No one's going to hurt you." The figure's eyes followed me, unblinking, and then in a soft, echoing voice they said, "We've been waiting." I froze. My flashlight shook in my hands. Waiting for what? I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer I didn't want to face. Suddenly, more figures appeared. Out of the shadows of the hallway, pale forms emerged. Some young, some older, all quiet, all watching me. None of them had records. None of them belonged to any files I could check. And yet, they moved with purpose, almost silently, following my steps with a patience that unsettled me beyond words. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. "I don't know where your files are," I said softly, more to reassure myself than them. "I'll try to find help." But the figures didn't respond in anger or fear. They simply shifted closer, and I realized a pattern. They weren't here to harm me, not directly. They were here to remind me, to warn me, to show me something I wasn't meant to forget. "Don't leave," one voice repeated. The same phrase now echoed by many, overlapping, layered, like whispers in the walls themselves. I felt the hair on my arms rise. My knees shook. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, and the scent of damp stone and old antiseptic filled my lungs. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, perhaps a hallucination, fatigue, the pressure of silence pressing too long. But my rational thoughts failed me when one of the figures reached out, not to touch, not to grab, just a hand extended, open, patient. And I understood these were patients without files, people erased from memory, forgotten by the hospital system, yet still present, still waiting. I turned toward the stairwell, my only route to safety, but the hallway stretched longer than it had been. Shadows pooled in impossible angles. Each step forward was matched by the quiet sound of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. I couldn't see anyone there, but I could feel them, watching, learning, patient. Stay with us? I realized the hospital itself had absorbed them, preserved them. The files didn't matter. The administration didn't matter. What mattered was the presence, the memory, the voices. They existed in the walls, in the shadows, in the silence. And the hospital remembered. I ran then carefully, keeping my flashlight on the floor ahead, tried to ignore the whispers now following me down the hallways, echoing my own movements, repeating my words back to me in soft, hollow tones. In the stairwell, I paused, gasping for air. The whispering seemed to surround me now, coming from above, below, the walls, the empty floors. "Don't leave." I reached the lobby again, the normal hum of the night shift machinery returning like a cruel joke. The voices faded, but I knew they hadn't gone. They were waiting, watching, patient, always patient. By the time my shift ended, I had recorded every detail I could, every sighting, every voice, every movement. The hospital kept its secrets well, but the patients without files had found me. They had chosen me as the witness. And I knew that when I returned tomorrow night, they would still be there, waiting, watching, whispering, not angry, not hostile, just present, just remembered. I left the hospital as dawn broke, feeling the quiet pressing behind me, lingering on my shoulders and my chest. It was heavier than the first night, heavier, patient, and impossible to shake. And I understood something then. Some people aren't gone when their files vanish. Some people linger, preserved by memory, by walls, by shadows, and the hospital never forgets. By the third night, I was learning the hospital's rhythm, not the logical rhythm of shifts, machines, or routine checks, but the subtle, unsettling pulse of the building itself. The whispers of patients without files haunted me still. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere beneath the quiet hallways and abandoned rooms, there was more, something hidden, patient, waiting. I returned to security desk around midnight. The building unusually still. My flashlight cut across the empty lobby, the dust motes floating in its beam. I signed in, started my patrol, and eventually found myself near the service elevator at the end of the east wing. I hadn't used it before. The panel looked ordinary, buttons numbered for the floors in operation, first through third. But then I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, almost imperceptible button beneath the panel, unlabeled, recessed into the metal. I hesitated. The air around the elevator felt thicker here, heavier somehow, like the walls were pressing in slightly. My hand hovered over the hidden button. I didn't know why I was drawn to it. Why my curiosity wouldn't let me walk away. I pressed it. The elevator shuddered to life, the lights flickering weakly, and the doors closed with a metallic groan that echoed unnaturally long down the shaft. I felt a strange vibration beneath my feet. Subtle at first, then stronger as the elevator descended. I watched the display, first, second, third, and then nothing. No numbers. Just a black void, as if the panel itself had swallowed the floor I was approaching. The descent was slow, agonizingly slow, the kind of slow that makes you notice every small sound. My own breathing filled the tiny metal space. The elevator hum was low, almost alive. I tried to remind myself it was just machinery, old and temperamental, but the hum seemed deliberate, patient, as if the elevator itself was aware of my presence. Then the doors opened. I stepped out into a floor that should not exist. The fluorescent lights were dim, flickering weakly as if struggling to survive. The walls were painted the same pale green as the rest of the hospital, but they were chipped, cracked, and damp in places I hadn't seen before. The floor tiles were faded, stained with time, and the air smelled of mildew, rust, and something I couldn't name, something that made my stomach twist. I checked my flashlight, sweeping across the hallway. Doors lined both sides, most closed, some ajar. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, heavy. I could feel it pressing in from all sides. As I moved down the corridor, I noticed movement in the shadows. Not full figures, just glimpses, shifts of darkness at the edge of my vision. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself that nerves played tricks, especially in a building like this, at this hour. But the unease in my chest told me it wasn't imagination. Something was here, something that had been waiting. I reached the first door on my right. It was labeled, faintly scratched into the paint. Observation room. I opened it slowly. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. Beds lined the walls. Empty, except for one. A figure lay on the farthest bed, curled tightly, pale as the moonlight. I swallowed hard. Hello. My voice was low, cautious. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. But I saw it breathe. Shallow, deliberate breaths that made the bed creak faintly under them. I stepped closer, flashlight trembling. No file, no record, nothing. I knelt by the bed, scanning the floor and the counter for a chart. A small clipboard lay on the bedside table, blank, the paper yellowed with age. I flipped it over. Nothing. No writing, no name. Just empty. The figure's head lifted slightly. Eyes wide, staring past me, unblinking. A voice, barely a whisper, came from their lips. We didn't leave. I froze. My heart hammered. The phrase echoed in my mind, familiar and horrifying. Patients without files. Waiting. Preserved in some liminal space beneath the hospital. I had been warned indirectly, and now I was here. I moved back, slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on them. The figure shifted, crawling from the bed in jerky, unnatural movements. The sound of scraping feet against tile echoed too loudly in the small room. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry. Don't go. Another whisper, soft, layer behind the first. I turned my beam toward the hallway and saw more figures emerging from the shadows. Their movements were slow, deliberate. Some limped, some dragged themselves along the floor, but all were unsteady, patient, as if rehearsed over decades of waiting. I backed toward the elevator. The air felt thick, almost liquid. Every breath was a struggle, heavy with moisture and something else, something like despair. My mind tried to rationalize. Patients abandoned here, forgotten in renovations, or maybe staff who had disappeared over the years. But I knew better. These weren't people in the usual sense anymore. They were remnants, shadows of memory, preserved by the hospital itself. The figures advanced, and I realized the floor was alive with whispers now, low murmurs, almost imperceptible at first, then overlapping, layering on each other. We're still here. Don't leave. Come back. Stay with us. I stumbled back into the elevator, slamming the doors shut. The hum of machinery filled my ears, drowning out the whispers for a moment. The panel showed the descent slowly, deliberately, as if teasing me, counting down to some unseen end. When the doors opened again, I was back on the first floor, but the hospital felt different. The lights were the same, the walls familiar, but I could still feel it. The presence of that hidden floor, the patient shadows lingering, patient and deliberate. I moved quickly through the corridors, checking doors, scanning cameras, recording every odd sound, every shifting shadow. But even in the main halls, far from the hidden floor, I felt the weight of observation. The whispers hadn't left. They had followed. By the end of my shift, I realized I had seen only a fraction of the hidden floor. Each room seemed to contain a fragment of the hospital's memory. A patient erased from records but preserved here. Waiting, learning, watching. I understood then that the hospital didn't forget. It collected, preserved, repeated. And some floors were meant only for those that had chosen to remember most. I left the building as dawn approached, my notebook filled with observations I wasn't sure anyone would believe. The elevator button was gone when I checked again, as if it had never existed. But I knew better. I had seen it, pressed it, I had descended. I had witnessed the hospital's hidden floor, alive in ways most would never imagine. And I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Some places keep more than memories. They keep people, not alive, not dead, something in between, something patient, waiting, and always learning. I first saw the listing on a gray, rainy morning, the kind where the world feels washed of color and warmth. The house was on the outskirts of town, at the end of a long, crooked lane, overgrown with weeds and the skeletal remains of trees. Even in the pictures, it looked tired, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it for decades, and no one ever had. As a real estate agent, I've seen my share of odd properties, but this one felt different. Not just abandoned, not just neglected. There was a heaviness to it, as if the air itself around the house was holding back, reluctant to move. I parked my car at the edge of the lane, letting the rain drizzle over me. The sign out front read, "For sale by owner." The paint was peeling, and the letters were barely visible. I approached the front door. It hung slightly off its hinges, swinging gently with the wind. The wood was cracked and gray, the handle cold under my fingers. I pressed the button on my phone to call the owner, but no one answered. Only the wind, only the soft, persistent drizzle against the roof. I stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, with a scent of damp wood and dust. It smelled like the house had been breathing in its own emptiness for decades. My flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper, faded carpets, and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. A grand piano sat in the corner of the parlor, its keys exposed, as if it had been played yesterday rather than decades ago. I walked through the room slowly, almost reverently, noting the details. The kitchen was coated in dust, dishes still in the sink, the remnants of someone's last meal frozen in time. Upstairs, bedrooms held beds neatly made, closets full of clothes that seemed pressed against the walls in anticipation. I had seen abandoned houses before, but this one felt preserved. That evening, I sat in my car, taking notes. The listing was over 50 years old. I learned passed from owner to owner, yet never sold. Neighbors whispered about the house, calling it cursed or unlucky, but no one could explain why. Every agent who tried to sell it left after a week. Claiming the house had a way of unsettling you, of making the walls feel alive. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in curses. But as I stared at the house through the rain, I couldn't deny the feeling that I wasn't alone. The windows, dark and reflective, seemed to watch me, almost like eyes, patient and calculating. The next day, I entered again, armed with my notebook and flashlight. I tried to ignore the chill that settled over me as soon as I stepped past the threshold. I moved room to room, documenting, photographing, imagining the listing copy I would write. Spacious four-bedroom home with vintage charm. I muttered under my breath, but the words fell hollow here. As I reached the stairwell, I noticed something strange. The stairs creaked under my weight, but the sound was layered, not just a groan of wood under pressure, but something beneath it, something else moving, shifting, almost whispering. I stopped, my breath caught. I listened. Silence. I shook my head. Of course. Just old wood, settling. Nothing more. But then I heard it again. Soft, almost imperceptible. A creak that wasn't mine. A step following mine, yet slower, patient. I paused at the top of the stairs. Flashlight trained on the hall. Empty. Not a shadow. Not a hint of movement. I forced myself forward. The bedrooms upstairs were still, silent. But the air seemed thicker, almost viscous, pressing against my chest. One room had a small desk. Paper scattered as if someone had just left, yet yellowed with age. I ran my hand over a sheet. It was blank, not faded. Blank. I could feel a presence then, patient, deliberate, not hostile, not threatening, just waiting. I swallowed hard. The house had been on the market for decades, untouched, unsold, yet somehow aware that I was here. I left the house that evening, noting every detail in my notebook, recording thoughts and observations. My car smelled faintly of damp when I returned, as if the house had followed me outside. I shook my head and drove back into town. Rational explanations. I told myself, old house, strange architecture, my imagination. That was all. That night I dreamed the house. Not the house as it was, but the house as it wanted to be remembered. Empty hallways stretching impossibly long. Furniture aligned perfectly as if awaiting a visitor. Windows reflecting faces I didn't recognize. Eyes wide, staring patient. I woke in a sweat, heart pounding, telling myself it was just a dream. The next day, I returned compelled. I had work to do, notes to take, photographs to capture. I pushed open the front door. The air was thicker than before, damp and almost oppressive. I noticed details I hadn't before. Scratches in wood near the door frame. Faint fingerprints in the dust. A whisper of movement from the corner of my vision. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. I was tired. I had been alone too long. But the rooms upstairs had changed slightly, not drastically. Subtle. The sheets were smoother. Beds aligned more evenly. Papers moved. I could swear the pencil on the desk had shifted, as if someone had written a word, then erased it. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response, only the soft creak of floorboards. And the whisper, so soft I almost didn't hear it, "Don't leave." I froze. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I told myself it was nothing, a draft, wind moving through the cracked windows. But the whisper repeated, layered now with another and another, until it felt as though the entire house was speaking in voices just beyond comprehension. Stay with us." I stumbled back down the stairs, heart hammering. The house wasn't trying to harm me. Not exactly. But it wanted me to notice, to acknowledge, to remember, to be part of its patient, endless waiting. I left once again, writing notes as quickly as my hands could move. Every time I glanced back, the windows reflected something I didn't want to see. Shapes, faces, watching. I told myself they were shadows, tricks of light, reflections of my own fear. But even then, deep down, I knew better. The house had been waiting for decades, and it would continue to wait, patient, deliberate, alive in a way no one could ever sell, no one could ever leave behind. I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. I didn't know why I kept going back. Curiosity? Obligation? Madness? Maybe all three. But I knew one thing. The house would not forget me. And I had a feeling I would not be the last to notice. The listing was still active, posted on the site, waiting for the next visitor. And the house? The house waited too. Patient, quiet, and somehow aware. I returned to the house a week after my first visit, compelled by something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Professional duty? Or the nagging, uneasy feeling that the house had noticed me, remembered me, and was waiting for me to come back. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low and gray, a heavy curtain over the crooked lane. As I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned under my weight. The front door, slightly more worn than last week, swung open with the faintest touch. Inside, the house was silent in a way that pressed against my ears. Not emptiness, something heavier. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but underneath that, a subtle, almost imperceptible sweetness lingered. I couldn't place it. It wasn't a smell you would normally notice, not if you were breathing normally. But when you pay attention, it's impossible to ignore. I walked to the parlor first, flashlight tracing over familiar furniture and draped sheets. The grand piano sat in its corner, keys exposed. I tapped one gently. The note was off, just slightly sharp, and it echoed unnaturally in the quiet room. My hand lingered over the ivory. It felt cold, almost alive. I pulled back, my skin crawling. I moved through the house slowly, noting that small changes had occurred since my last visit. A chair slightly shifted. A book lay open on a table, though I was certain it hadn't been. Pages fluttered faintly in a non-existent breeze. And then I noticed the first thing that made me truly pause. An object, a small leather wallet, lying at the base of the staircase. I picked it up, flipping it open carefully. Inside was a driver's license, dated 3 decades ago, with a man's face I didn't recognize. I set it down on the table. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from any of the neighbors I knew. But the unsettling part wasn't that it was there. It was that I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase from the first night. The house remembers. It occurred to me. Then, slowly, like a drip of water over hours. Maybe people who visit this house, buyers, agents, curious wanderers, don't leave the same way they came in. Maybe they leave more than they realize. A memory, an object, a piece of themselves, left behind like breadcrumbs for the house to collect. I walked upstairs, each step creaking loudly in the thick silence. The bedrooms were unchanged in appearance, yet I could feel a subtle weight in each room, as if it were remembering every visitor who had ever stood there. Dust was displaced, sheets slightly shifted, doors closing themselves just enough to be noticed. In the farthest bedroom, I found another object, a scarf, delicate, woven with intricate patterns. It wasn't mine, but it smelled faintly of someone who had been here before. Perhaps one of the many buyers the house had already swallowed in its decades-long waiting. I held it in my hands, and I felt the weight of time, of memory, pressing in. It was as if the scarf itself carried traces of the person who had left it behind. Their hope, their hesitation, their desire to leave and yet stay. I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, trying to calm the rising awareness in my chest. The house had a patience I could almost taste. It didn't demand attention. It didn't shout. It simply waited quietly, deliberately, and everyone who entered unknowingly gave it something. Everyone left a piece behind. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time in the house was unreliable. I walked the halls again, flashlights sweeping over the faded carpets, the peeling wallpaper. Small objects appeared in new places. A ring on the mantel, a notebook on a chair, a single shoe near the kitchen doorway. All of them belonged to someone who had passed through. All of them left as if the house had claimed them, but without malice, just collection. I began to notice the subtle details I hadn't seen before. Scratches in the walls, faint as pencil marks, forming shapes that suggested faces, figures, gestures. The air shifted around me, slightly cooler, heavier, as if the house were breathing in rhythm with my own. I felt it observing me, not hostile, but aware, patient, waiting. And then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first. The sound of paper turning. I froze. No one else was here. My footsteps stopped. The whisper of movement came from upstairs. Slowly, carefully, I moved toward the sound, flashlight shaking in my grip. In the study, a desk drawer was slightly open. I hadn't touched it. I leaned closer, heart pounding, and the sound stopped. Inside the drawer, a photograph. A family, smiling, sitting on the porch of the house. The date on the back, 1976. I frowned. I didn't recognize the people. But the photograph radiated a subtle weight, like it had been holding a memory for decades. The house, I realized, had a way of preserving people. Not fully alive, not fully gone, just kept. And every visitor, every buyer, every agent who had walked through those halls had contributed, leaving behind a fragment of themselves, their hope, their fear, their memories. And the house collected them all, patiently, like a library of lives. I stumbled back toward the hallway, flashlight cutting through the dim light. I noticed in the faint outline of another object pressed against the wall. A locket. I picked it up. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young girl. No name, no date, just her eyes wide, watching, patient. I felt a chill in my chest. I had the sinking realization that the house didn't just take objects. It took presence, attention, identity, a piece of anyone who lingered long enough. I set the locket back on the wall and stepped back. My breath came faster now. The whispers of objects, memories, the faint echo of long-gone lives press against me. I felt their presence in the shadows, in the quiet corners, in the air itself. And yet, the house did not threaten. It simply remembered. I left the house that evening carrying my notes, flashlight, and a growing unease. On the drive home, I kept thinking of the phrase again. The house remembers. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. But it was aware. And awareness, in a place like that, could be enough. Later that night, I realized I had forgotten something. My notebook, the one I had used to document the house, was missing. I reached for it instinctively, then remembered I had set it on the kitchen counter before leaving. It wasn't there. Not in my bag, not in the car. I checked every corner, retracing my steps. Nothing. A sinking feeling washed over me. The house had taken it, not to punish me, not to scare me, but to add to its collection. My observations, my thoughts, my presence, traces of me left behind for it to keep. And somewhere in the darkness, I felt the house exhale, patient, deliberate, satisfied. I didn't go back immediately. I told myself I was busy, cautious, rational. But I knew I would return. People always do. Agents, buyers, wanderers, drawn back by curiosity, by fascination, by the subtle pull of the place that collects fragments of the living and the past. And I knew I had already left my first piece behind, my presence stitched into the very walls. The house had no urgency. It could wait, decades, centuries, if it wished, and each person who visited, unaware, gave a piece of themselves to it. The wallet, the scarf, the locket, and me, too, slowly, invisibly, becoming part of its quiet, endless collection. I closed my eyes that night and saw the hallways lined with the objects of the past, each one humming softly with memory, all of them patient, all of them waiting. And I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that I had become one more fragment in the house's enduring awareness, another piece left behind for the house to remember forever. I didn't sleep well that night. Even with the streetlights casting their weak glow across my apartment, I felt eyes on me, watching, patient, knowing. It wasn't just the house on my mind. It was the fragments I had left behind. The wallet, the scarf, the locket, and me. I had brushed it off at first as an odd coincidence, but I couldn't shake the creeping awareness. The house didn't just wait for people. It kept them, slowly, quietly, in pieces that stayed long after you walked away. The next morning, I drove back. I told myself it was professional curiosity, notes I had lost, photographs I needed to take. But deep down, I knew it was more than that, a pull I couldn't resist. When I pulled up the crooked lane, the house loomed in the pale dawn light, indifferent and patient. I parked and sat in the car, staring at it for longer than I should have. It seemed familiar now, like an old acquaintance who had known me longer than I had known myself. The front door creaked open when I touched it. Easy this time, almost welcoming. The air inside was thicker than I remembered, warm with a faint scent of vanilla and with polish. But under it, that same undertone of something older, something patient. I moved slowly through the rooms, flashlight in hand, noting changes. Objects had shifted again. A chair in the parlor was slightly turned, as though someone had recently sat in it. A teacup on the mantel was tilted, faint fingerprints smudging its surface. And in the corner of the room, something I hadn't noticed before, a small notebook lying on the floor, its cover plain and unmarked. I picked it up and opened it. Inside were notes, sketches, scraps of handwriting from people I didn't know. One page read, "I came to see the house. Now I can't stop thinking about it. It feels alive." Another, "Left something behind, but don't remember what." Each entry was brief, careful, and yet each carried the same sense of unease I had felt from the first moment I stepped inside. It dawned on me slowly, with a cold clarity, that I was not the first to notice the house in this way. People had come before, left pieces of themselves, and perhaps returned in ways they didn't understand. The notebook trembled slightly in my hands, not from wind, there was none, but as if the house were nudging me, reminding me that it had seen everything. I went upstairs, moving carefully. The bedrooms were unchanged in their outward appearance, but the air was different. Heavy, full of memories and presence I couldn't touch, but could feel pressing against my chest, slow and deliberate. My flashlight trembled as I shined it into corners, across furniture, over sheets that seemed smoother than they had been when I first entered. And then I saw it, a small, delicate mirror leaning against the wall, reflecting not just my image but faint shapes behind me. Shapes I couldn't fully make out, blurred and distant, but undeniably there. I stepped closer. The mirror fogged slightly, and when I breathed on it, words appeared, etched in condensation, though there was no one there to write them. You are already part of us. I staggered back, heart hammering. The house had claimed pieces of everyone, and I had already left mine. I realized then that the wallet, the scarf, the locket, they weren't just objects. They were conduits, containers, fragments of presence. And I had left mine, unknowingly, the first night. My attention, my awareness, my memories, all stored quietly by the house. I walked to the edge of the hallway and looked down the stairs. The air seemed to shimmer, heavy with unseen weight. Footsteps echoed faintly behind me. Though I was alone, the whispers were soft, patient, insistent. Not words I could understand, but a tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I realized I wasn't alone. Not really. Never had been. Every person who had entered had left pieces behind, and in some quiet, intangible way, they were still here. They lingered in the dust motes and the sunlight, in the air that shifted as I moved, in the faint creak of the floorboards. Their presence pressed against mine, a subtle weight that made the house feel alive in a way I had only half believed before. I tried to leave the room, but the hallway seemed longer than it had been, stretching in ways that defied reason. Each door I passed seemed to watch me, and as I glanced toward the staircase, I saw shadows of people I didn't know, faint, translucent shapes standing just inside the rooms, patient, quiet, observing. They weren't threatening. Not yet, but they were aware, and I felt the undeniable pull. The house wanted me to notice, to acknowledge, to accept that a part of me belonged here now. I stumbled down the stairs, flashlight catching glimpses of objects I hadn't seen before. A pair of shoes neatly aligned, a ring on the banister, a scarf draped over a chair, all left by previous visitors. All fragments of lives that the house had collected, preserved, remembered. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my chest heaving. I thought I was free. I thought I had left. But the house had followed me, not in the literal sense. Not chasing me or calling after me, but in the way it had taken a piece of me. Quietly, without asking. I could feel it in my thoughts, in the lingering unease, in the sensation that a part of my awareness remained behind in those walls, alongside the others. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the crooked lane, at the looming shape of the house. Its windows caught the fading light, reflective and watchful. It did not move, did not call, did not need to. It had all it needed already. Fragments of the living, the curious, the hopeful. And now me too. That night, I lay awake, thinking of all the objects I had seen, all the pieces of people left behind. The house didn't care about time. It didn't rush. It simply waited, patient, deliberate, eternal. And I realized that when people leave, the house is never empty. Not really. It is full of memory, full of presence, full of fragments of life that linger quietly in the dust, in the air, in the spaces between walls and floorboards. I could almost feel them now, the echoes of every visitor who had come before me, whispering softly in the corners of my mind. Not threats, not warnings, just reminders. Reminders that the house is patient, deliberate, and aware, and that my own fragment of attention, my own memory, was now part of its collection. Sleep came only in shallow bursts, haunted by glimpses of objects moving slightly in my mind, rearranging themselves as if guided by an unseen hand. My dreams were filled with the house, endlessly patient, endlessly waiting. Rooms stretching impossibly long, objects shifting, fragments of people whispering, calling, observing. And somewhere the endless quiet, I heard my own voice mingling with theirs. In the morning, I realized I could no longer separate myself from it. The house had claimed a part of me, quietly, without malice, without effort, and I understood, with a chilling clarity, that I would return. Not because I wanted to, not because I had to, but because a piece of me was already there, calling me back, patient and deliberate. The house waits for all who enter, collecting fragments of life, attention, presence. And now it waits for me too, not with malice, not with urgency, only with quiet, deliberate patience. Because once you leave a piece behind, the house never forgets, and I can never leave. It was just past midnight when the dead air began. The kind of silence that isn't quiet but heavy, the kind that sits in your chest and presses against your ribs until you notice every tiny sound, every creak of the building, every hum of the equipment, every distant car on the empty street outside. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue. Another long night. Another stretch of broadcast that felt like it would never end. I host the overnight slot at a small, mostly forgotten radio station. The audience is thin at this hour. Maybe a handful of insomniacs truckers or night shift workers who press play and leave the volume low. Mostly, the night is a companionable void. Dead air, the softest of static. The occasional record playing its lonely notes across the empty town. But that night was different. I was midway through reading the usual announcements when a faint signal cut through the static. Soft, like a whisper beneath the hiss of the equipment. I paused, hand hovering over the microphone. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch, a stray frequency bleeding through from somewhere far away. But then I noticed something unsettling. The signal wasn't random. It was deliberate. There was a rhythm, a cadence, a pattern in the soft tones, like someone trying to speak, but only half had learned the language. I leaned closer to the mixer, adjusting the dials carefully. The whispering persisted, faint but distinct, curling around the edges of my consciousness. I whispered into the microphone, half joking, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded fragile in the empty studio. The signal paused, almost like it had heard me, then resumed in a series of soft clicks, subtle tonal shift that made my skin crawl. I checked the equipment. Nothing unusual. Everything looked normal. No incoming calls, no automated feeds, no recorded loops. Just the faint, unplaceable signal pressing against the dead air. It wasn't loud, but it was close, intimate, insistent. I could feel in the room, in my ears, in the hollow space behind my eyes. I sank into the chair, heart beating faster than it should for someone alone in a quiet studio. It wasn't fear exactly. Not yet. It was anticipation, a creeping curiosity wrapped in the same tension that grips you when you walk down an empty street and think you hear footsteps just behind you. I adjusted the frequency, tried to isolate it. The more I listened, the more the pattern seemed to form words, almost but not quite, fragmented sentences, syllables I could recognize, twisted into something alien. "Can you hear me?" I blinked. The voice was there, not from a caller, not from the station. It was inside the static, inside the hiss, embedded in the dead air. I froze, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fascination. It wasn't a recording, not entirely. It was responsive. I said nothing, listening, my mind straining to catch the next fragment. "Do not go." The words were soft, hesitant, almost trembling. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. My hands were clammy. I tried to trace the source. Nothing. No signal on the monitor. No interference from any external feed. Just a sound pressed into the airwaves themselves. Somehow, impossibly, it was part of the broadcast. Part of the room. Part of me now. In some way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was an anomaly. A hallucination caused by sleep deprivation, by the hours alone with my thoughts, with the hum of the transmitter, with the softest of dead air stretching into the void. But then the whispers grew more precise, more intentional. "You're listening." A shiver crawled up my spine. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the console, the coils of cables, the blinking lights. My rational mind struggled to anchor itself to reality. Signals don't speak. Frequencies don't whisper. Dead air doesn't move. And yet it did. It shifted, pulsed, as if aware I was paying attention. I reached for the microphone again. "Who is this?" I whispered, voice shaking. The response was immediate, soft, almost imperceptible. "I wait." A pause, longer this time. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. The signal wasn't just speaking. It was thinking, pausing, waiting for my reaction. I realized with a strange, sinking certainty that it knew I was here. It knew I was listening, and it didn't want to be ignored. I spent hours at night adjusting frequencies, recording segments, trying to trace the signal, to catch a pattern I could explain. But it eluded me. Every adjustment I made, every knob I turned, seemed only to sharpen the whisper, to make it clearer, closer, more deliberate. It wasn't random. It was waiting. It was aware. And the more I listened, the more I understood it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. By 3 a.m, exhaustion had blurred the edges of my consciousness. I kept the microphone on, soft music playing to cover the static, but I could feel the signal pressing against the walls, against my mind. It moved in the spaces between notes, between sentences, between breaths. And I realized then that the dead air was never truly dead. It was full of memory, full of something unseen, something patient. At one point, I reached for my notebook to jot down the fragments I had heard. When I looked up, the whispering had stopped. The silence that returned was not empty. It was waiting, dense, expectant, as if the studio itself had held its breath. I could feel the pressure, the quiet insistence pressing against me, urging me to stay, to listen, to continue. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By dawn, the signal had faded, slipping back into the static, leaving only a faint, lingering resonance in my ears. My notes were disjointed, fragmented, but each line carried the same sense of awareness, the same unspoken warning. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. When morning finally broke, I left the studio with the sensation that part of me had stayed behind. The air smelled the same as it had during the whispers, faintly metallic, faintly sweet, faintly alive. And I knew, as I walked through the empty streets toward home, that tonight, when the station returned to dead air, it would be waiting again, for me, for anyone who would listen. Because dead air is never really dead. Not when something knows you're paying attention. Not when something waits in silence, patient, deliberate, aware. And I had already heard it call my name. I wouldn't be able to ignore it. I couldn't. And when midnight comes again, I'll be there, headphones on, microphone ready, waiting for the whisper that is never truly silent. And when it comes, I'll listen. The next night, I returned to the studio before midnight, earlier than usual. I didn't want to, not really. Part of me wanted to stay home, to ignore the pull of the equipment, to pretend that last night had been a dream or a hallucination. But the other part of me, the part that had already left pieces behind in that empty air, insisted I come. The headphones felt heavier than they should as I settled into the chair, the microphone positioned just in front of my lips. The station hummed quietly, dead air filling the room, but I knew better. I had learned to listen not just with my ears, but with every sense tuned to the spaces in between. The faint were the transmitter, the soft vibration of the floor beneath me, the subtle pressure in the air that hinted at presence. I adjusted the dials carefully, fingers trembling just slightly, and waited. It began slowly, almost teasingly. At first, it was faint static, the usual background noise that always made the night feel larger than it was. But then a whisper cut through, a voice, low and hesitant. Hesitant as if afraid it might be overheard. "Did you see what happened?" I froze. The question wasn't directed at me. Not really. But it was meant to be heard. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, the headphones pressing the sound directly into my mind. The voice came again, this time clearer, a soft narration that carried with it the weight of memory, fear, and confession. It was describing a crime. The words were not part of the nightly news, not something I had seen on any report, no headline or police log. The voice spoke of details, locations, times, the subtle sounds no one else noticed, that suggested events hidden in plain sight. And yet, as I listened, I realized with slow, sinking chill that these crimes had never been recorded anywhere. No files, no evidence, no traces. Just the voice speaking from the dead air itself. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had recorded these events secretly. Maybe a whistleblower, a confessor, a guilty observer. Maybe the signal was an archive of forgotten deeds, replaying itself through the frequencies, waiting for someone like me to notice. But as I listened, I realized it was more than that. The words were alive, evolving with each broadcast, not merely replayed, not fixed, but adapting to my presence, aware I was listening, aware I was paying attention. Details that should have been vague were unervingly precise. The exact creak of a floorboard, the faint metallic scent that lingered after a door slammed, the subtle way a shadow moved when no one else was around. It was as though the voice could see through me, knew that I needed more than words. I needed to feel it, to understand it, to be drawn into the act itself without ever being there. I found myself scribbling in my notebook, hands moving almost automatically. Names, locations, descriptions, some familiar, some completely foreign. But each carried the same thread of dread, the same quiet insistence that these crimes were real, that they had happened, and that the world had chosen not to see them. The whispering grew, layering over itself. Sometimes multiple voices spoke in near synchrony, overlapping fragments that made the stories feel almost theatrical, though they were stark and real in their horror. A neighbor recounting an argument, a passerby noticing an unusual movement, a voice pleading for help. Nothing official, nothing documented, but all undeniably alive in the broadcast. One particular story made me freeze. The voice described a man dragging something heavy across the floor late at night. A scream that no one had heard. A body hidden beneath floorboards, beneath carpeting that seemed ordinary in the daylight. The narrator's tone was not sensationalized, not dramatic. It was matter of fact, almost clinical, as if recounting a routine memory. I leaned back in the chair, heart hammering. I checked my notes. There were no reports, no news clippings, no record in any public database. And yet, I could see it all in my mind. The room, the shadows, the weight of the deed pressing silently against the walls. My stomach churned, but I couldn't stop listening. I couldn't walk away. The broadcast shifted again. This time, the voices were more insistent, almost urgent. They began to respond to my thoughts, to my reactions, to the slight shivers that traveled up my spine when the details became too vivid. The frequency pulsed, faintly, subtly, like a heartbeat. The words seemed to wrap around me, filling the corners of the studio, the spaces behind the equipment, even the empty chair across from me. It became clear, slowly, that the signal was not just relaying information. It was interacting. It was testing me. It wanted me to feel the full weight of what had been hidden, to know the forgotten histories of a world that claimed ignorance, while the truth lingered quietly, patiently, in the spaces that no one noticed. Hours passed in this strange, suspended time. I spoke little, whispered occasionally, though I wasn't sure the voice needed me to respond. The stories kept coming. Account of thefts, assaults, disappearances. Each more vivid, more intimate, more impossible to verify. I could almost see the rooms, feel the air, hear the faint echoes of footsteps. And the longer I listened, the more I understood the unspoken rule. The dead air preserves what the living ignore. Somewhere near 3 a.m, I realized I hadn't moved. My legs had stiffened. My hands ached from holding the notebook too tightly. My throat was dry, but I could not leave. Not yet. I could feel the signal pressing, like a soft hand urging me to stay, to bear witness, to remember. The strangest part, the part that unsettled me more than the whispered crimes themselves, was that the voices sometimes became eerily familiar. Not names, not faces, but the cadence, the intonation. A neighbor's lilt I had recognized long ago. The pattern of my own town streets in their description. The careful observation of things that only a few people noticed. Things I noticed because I had spent nights like this before. It made me shiver. Not because it was supernatural, though part of me wanted to rationalize it as such, but because the world suddenly felt much smaller, much more intimate than it should have. The unreported, the unnoticed, the ignored, they all lived quietly alongside us. And the dead air had learned how to speak their language. When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, the whispers began to fade. The frequency returned to normal static. The studio seemed larger, emptier, as if the night had expanded and then contracted, leaving me alone with my notes, my fatigue, and my thoughts. I left the station with a new understanding. Not fear exactly, not yet, but a creeping, patient unease. Somewhere in the invisible waves, in the spaces between signals, someone or something was keeping records the world would never acknowledge. And I had heard them. I had been their witness. That night, when I lay in bed, the frequency seemed to hum faintly in my skull, a reminder that the dead air never truly sleeps. It waits, it listens, and it remembers. I knew I would return the next night, headphones in place, microphone ready. Because once you hear the voices from unreported crimes, the world itself feels insufficient. You realize the forgotten, the ignored, and the hidden exist not just in memory, but in a space that hums quietly beneath everything else. And I cannot unhear them, because they are waiting, and they know I am listening. It started subtly, almost innocuously, as if testing the waters. I was adjusting the mixer, checking levels, listening to the dead air when I heard it, a fragment of my own voice, low, almost drowned in the static. At first, I thought it was a playback from a previous recording, a delayed echo of my own late-night ramblings. But there was something wrong. The words weren't for me. Not exactly. The tone, the pacing, the slight hesitation. They were mine, yes, familiar in the most intimate way. Yet the sentences were strange, unfamiliar, describing scenes I hadn't yet witnessed, actions I hadn't yet taken. I froze, hand hovering over the microphone. My pulse jumped. He leans back in his chair, fingers trembling as he touches the console, unaware of what is waiting just beyond the frequency. That was exactly what I had been doing. Exactly. And yet, I hadn't said those words aloud. Not yet. I leaned closer to the headphones, careful not to disturb the mic, listening as the broadcast continued, layering over the gentle hum of static. The sentences became longer, more deliberate. The voice described me walking through the studio, lifting the microphone, scribbling in my notebook, pausing at intervals to listen to the faint whispers that only I could perceive. Every movement, every breath, captured in uncanny detail. I wanted to laugh, to shake my head, to convince myself it was some bizarre equipment malfunction. But the longer I listened, the harder it became to separate the reality from the broadcast. Each word, each phrase, resonated with the present moment, yet predicted what I was about to do next. And with each line, a creeping sensation settled over me. The voice was not just describing me. It was drawing me in, claiming me, making me part of the signal. He hesitates, pen poised over paper, sensing the weight of something unseen pressing against him. The air grows heavier, filled with quiet anticipation, as if the studio itself is holding its breath. I pressed the mute button, heart hammering, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, clear in my headphones, the words flowing seamlessly, as if my own mind had narrated them. My fingers shook. My eyes darted around the room. The studio felt smaller now, tighter, every shadow more defined, every corner a potential witness to what was happening. I realized with a chill that the broadcast had evolved. It was no longer external. It wasn't just a signal sent across the airwaves. It was inside the studio, inside the equipment, inside me. I could feel it in my chest, in the tips of my fingers, in the faint pressure behind my eyes. The whispers of unreported crimes, the half-formed sentences, the fragmented voices of those lost. They were converging into a single persistent awareness, and I was part of it. He will soon understand that listening is no longer enough, that the air carries more than voices, that every breath he takes is noted, every movement captured, every thought anticipated. I stumbled back from the desk, unhooking the headphones, but the voice persisted. It described my reaction, my confusion, my terror, with unnerving precision. I could feel my heartbeat thumping in the quiet of the studio, and the broadcast mirrored it, syncing with my pulse as if it were aware, somehow, of my biology, of my existence beyond the equipment. I sank into the chair, overwhelmed. The voice softened now, coaxing, intimate, yet impossible. It spoke as though it knew my fears, my regrets, my private thoughts. It whispered my loneliness, my exhaustion, the endless nights I had spent alone with dead air and soft static, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. And now it had found me. He thought he was the observer, the one who witnesses. But he is never merely watching. The broadcast has claimed him. He is no longer outside. He is inside, a participant, and every word he speaks, every note he hums, every whisper he responds to, feeds the signal, strengthens its presence. I tried to speak into the microphone, to assert my control, to say something, anything, but the words faltered. The voice spoke over me, anticipating the syllables I hadn't yet formed. My own voice distorted, narrating my hesitation, my attempts to resist my fear. I could feel my hands trembling on the desk, and the broadcast described them, down to the subtle curl of my fingers, the slight twitch in my wrist. I was part of the story now. The observer had become observed. The listener had become the broadcast itself, and the air hummed around me, alive with quiet menace. Every crackle in the static carried meaning. Every whisper that had once described unreported crimes now described me in intimate, unavoidable detail. He will realize too late that listening is participation, that the static remembers, that the silence collects, that the dead air waits patiently for those who pay attention. He will see the shift, the subtle change in the room, and he will understand that no one truly listens alone, that the voices are never just voices, that the listener is never merely a witness. I shut my eyes, breathing shallowly, trying to pull myself back from the edge of disbelief, rational thought, memory, fatigue, all of it tangled into a web of sound and sensation that made it impossible to distinguish the real from the imagined. I could feel the studio around me, yes, but it felt like a stage set for something larger, something unseen, something patient and intent on shaping me into part of the signal. I opened my notebook and began writing without thinking, following the descriptions of the broadcast, transcribing every word. Each phrase pulled me deeper, made me more aware of my place in the narrative. I was no longer merely hosting a radio show. I was the conduit. The words flowed through me, from me, into the empty night and back again, cycling endlessly, feeding the signal, feeding the voices. He is aware now. He can feel the threads connecting him to the frequencies, to the whispers, to the crimes remembered and unremembered. And he knows that he cannot leave. Not entirely. Not ever. Because once you are part of the broadcast, you remain. The dead air has a way of keeping what it touches. He will return, and he will listen, and he will speak, and it will listen back. Hours passed in this strange limbo. I lost track of time, of sense of reality. The voice described my movements, my thoughts, my breathing, as if I had surrendered entirely to its awareness. And in a way I had, because resisting was impossible. Listening was no longer voluntary. It had become a compulsion, a tether to something larger, something patient, something alive in the static and the dead air. By the faint gray light of early dawn, the voice finally receded. The frequencies returned to their usual hum. The air felt lighter, yet my chest was heavy with a new understanding. The dead air wasn't merely a medium anymore. It was a presence, aware and patient, and I was now part of it. Every broadcast, every whisper, every unseen crime, every secret carried in the frequencies. They were mine now, too. I left the studio that morning with trembling hands and a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. The city outside seemed unchanged, ordinary, unaware of the invisible presence that now threaded itself through my life. But I knew better. I could feel the quiet pull even now, in the daylight, in the empty streets, in the subtle vibration of the headphones sitting on my desk at home. I had become a participant. The broadcast had claimed me, and when midnight comes again, the signal will return, the whispers will resume, and I will speak with my own voice words I have not yet formed, words that have always existed in the dead air, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to become part of it, because now I am not merely the host. I am the broadcast, And the broadcast does not forget.